compassionate and merciful. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. I ask Allah to guide my heart and to guide my tongue, to speak that which is true, to guide us to that which is correct and right. First of all, I just wanted to begin with a note about why this topic is so important to me on a personal level. And the reason is because I probably have not told maybe one person in my life about what happened, but there's some benefit in sharing something personal. And that is that when I was in college, I took a philosophy class. And in that philosophy class about critical thinking, the professor asked us a number of questions. And the way that he asked those questions was very interesting and very degrading as well. He said, how many of you still believe that breaking a mirror causes 7 years of bad luck? How many of you still believe in God? And I was one of the few who actually raised my hand. And that was something very destructive for me as a Muslim. And from that point, for about 6 months after thinking about it, I was, you can say, an agnostic or an atheist. And this is my status, this is my history, this is what happened to me. And from after that point, I began to study, I began to read, I began to travel. For those of you who know me, I've traveled around the world in over 45 countries, and most of those places I was seeking answers to the questions that I had. So I went and I read Socrates, I read Aristotle, I read Aquinas, I read Kant, I read Nietzsche, I read all of these different philosophers trying to find the answers that I was looking for. But what I didn't realize is that I was only looking from one perspective, and that is a Western perspective. Nobody in their right mind growing up in my field who, when we see a person with a turban around his head, this person cannot answer any of these questions. This person cannot possibly think rationally the same way that these philosophers are thinking rationally. Until I stumbled across the likes of Ghazali, until I stumbled across the likes of Ibn Rushd, Averroes, until I stumbled across the likes of Ibn Taymiyyah, until I stumbled across the likes of modern scholars like Zandani. And then I began to realize that things were not as it seemed. So I just want to begin with that introduction and tell you that this is very personal to me. And this is why I decided to go ahead and continue with this opportunity to present. Does Allah exist? So I'm going to give some of the answers that I've discovered, some of the answers that were very satisfactory to me, and which seem so plain and so clear that when I look back, I say, I can't believe that I didn't see these things before. The only way I didn't see them because I was distracted. The only way that I didn't see them was because I had a very good education, as they say. This is the only way I failed to see these things. So number one, where does the burden of proof lie? When we're talking about belief in Allah and we're talking about atheism or disbelief, not saying that God does not exist, saying that Allah does not exist. Allah is the word for God, by the way. We're just using that for tonight. Where does the burden of proof lie? This is a very, very important question. And if you don't have the answer to this question, you're going to start out on the wrong path and you will never be able to arrive anywhere. So first of all, atheism is not the default position. And most people think that it is. Most people think that, well, if you don't follow anything, then you're an atheist. If you don't believe in anything, if you don't think, if you don't do any, you don't put any effort into something, then you're automatically an atheist. Just like, for example, if you're in class and you're enrolled and you do nothing, you receive an F. But they believe that this is the default position from the beginning. And I'm going to explain to you why it's not. Number one. The misconception number one is that reason and science is on the side of the atheist. And this is what we have been taught. This is what we have grown up with. That when you talk about religion, whenever you talk about Allah, when you talk about God, most people feel that, well, reason and science it's not compatible with that. It's something completely different. And the reason for that has to do with medieval Christianity in Europe, the way it was brought and that there was a history between the atheists and a history between the medieval Christians and the church. Now that's one issue. The second thing is, the misconception number 2 is that disbelief requires no mental effort. Meaning you don't actually have to go and put anything in. You don't have to think about it. If you don't think, then you're on the side of disbelief, because you don't believe, therefore it's disbelief. But this is a wrong way of phrasing the argument. Let us look at how it is phrased. You see, it's a very wrong analogy to simply put someone on trial and say, well, you have to convince me. So if you don't give them the answer that they're looking for, say, I don't accept the answer. And they say, well, I'll give you another answer, I'll give you another proof or another belief why I believe Allah exists. You say, well, I don't accept that answer either. And you keep going and you say, well, what about you? Say, I'm not here on trial. You're the one who's on trial because you're making a claim, I'm not making a claim. This is a wrong analogy. A better analogy is, a more fair analogy is, imagine that there's a crime that took place. There's a dead body on the floor right now. There's 2 detectives. One detective comes along and says, you know what? This looks like a murder. It doesn't look like a suicide as people are claiming. This looks like a murder because I'm going and I'm looking at this clue, and I looked at this clue, I looked at this evidence. It seems like a murder to me. And detective number 2 says, well, I'm not convinced. He says, okay, well, what is your explanation for this dead body on the floor? Oh, I don't have an explanation. I'm not giving you an answer, but I'm just saying I don't accept what you say. You see the problem with that? The same thing, if you take, for example, the fall of the banking system in America, an example closer to home. If you look, what led to the cause? Was it the banks? Was it subprime mortgages? Was it the inflation rate? What was the extra interest? Was there corruption going on? If somebody makes a claim, one economist says this is the reason, and the other economist B says, no, I don't accept that reason. Does that mean that economist B has the default position? No. You have to give an explanation because there's something there in front of you. This world, this reality that we live in is in front of you. You have to give it an explanation. There's no random default position that all of a sudden, well, I don't like what you have to say, and I don't like what you have to say, therefore I'm going to remain in my default position. This is an incorrect analogy and an incorrect way of starting. So the burden of proof is on both sides. It's not on one side. Other people have to explain what their position as well. So keep this in mind. Number 2, blind belief. You look at the example of the mirror I gave you, right? Many people believe that believing in Allah is a leap of faith that you just have to take. And you find that to many people, I know many Muslims who say that. When you start talking to them, you just have to believe. Now what does that mean, you just have to believe? If you mean that, well, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever, there's no good reason to believe in it, it goes against your intellect, it goes against your rationality, but you just have to believe. Just you feel something and then you just believe. Then what's the difference between that and a superstition? What's the difference between that and believing that a mirror is going to break and all of a sudden you have 7 years of bad luck? What if somebody tells you, well, you just have to believe? There's no differentiation. And when someone wants to make that claim, if they're trying to say that Allah exists, and say, you just have to believe, you put yourself in the weakest position, and you've actually gone against what the Quran teaches. Because the Quran doesn't say that. It doesn't say just believe. The Quran gives reasons. It gives explanations. And we're not going to get into too much detail, but all of this is basically coming from the Quran. My arguments are coming from the Quran. So it's not a leap of faith. Keep this in mind. It's not about blind belief and you just have to, just feel it inside of you and it just comes. Because if that was the case, belief could not be universal. And then the atheist would have an answer for you. He said, how can you expect me to believe? You say we all have to believe in God and then we all have to worship Him. How can we possibly do that if some of you get the feeling, some other people don't get the feeling? So there needs to be something wired inside of you, what we call fitrah in Islam, the natural disposition that leads you to this belief. The next thing is, when you realize this, that there's no leap of faith, when you realize that it's not about blind belief and you have to have some reasons, some people, or many people, actually start leaving the inherited beliefs that they had. So when you ask the average person, what do you believe in? Well, my parents are Muslim, or my parents are Christian, or my parents were atheists. and you start leaving those beliefs because you start questioning. But that positive questioning can actually do something to you. When you find the truth, it will actually make you stronger. It will make you stronger because it's a positive criticism. It will make you so strong that when someone else comes with an argument now, all of a sudden you say, hey, that doesn't bother me because I know the answer to that. And I have so many other reasons for believing. Even if you can't answer one of their arguments, you have such a strong foundation, such a strong base, so that doesn't take down all the other things that I have. That doesn't take down all the other things that I believe in and that I know to be true. So it just makes you stronger. The next question is belief natural? Is belief in Allah, is it something natural? I talked about that fitrah. Are you hardwired with it? Is it natural, or is it something completely random like believing in the mirror breaking? It's not natural. Is this natural or is it not? We're going to look. The Quran, if you look at the Quran, it rarely addresses atheists. That's interesting. Right? It rarely addresses atheists. The vast majority of the verses in the Quran are always addressing people who believe in Allah, believe in a supreme being, but then they worship others. Every prophet that comes, you see him saying, from Noah to Abraham, to all the different prophets mentioned in the Quran, you find all of them calling their people and saying, worship God, don't worship other things. Worship Allah, don't worship other things. They don't go and take the extra effort to say, well, why don't you believe in Allah? Believe that He exists, and then they start talking about worship. Now, why is that? It does address atheists, by the way. Surah Al-Dahab, you can look it up. The surah about Surah Al-Insan, the one about the human being, it's there. But in the 29th section of the Quran. But it rarely addresses them. Rarely addresses them. Why? Because the vast majority of people throughout history have always believed in a supreme being. In history, as well as today, atheists are a historical minority. And when I say atheists, I mean people who reject. Yes, there's a billion agnostics, there's a billion secular people. But an agnostic is somebody different from an atheist in the sense that they're not sure, they haven't made up their mind. People who reject and say, no, I do not believe in God, I do not believe in a higher power, I believe in this other explanation that there's no meaning, that there's none of this stuff, they're considered to be even the minority of the minority within that category of agnostics. Now, how do we get to this? Is belief natural? I want to give you 4 principles. While you're going through the 4 principles, I want you to ask yourself if these principles make sense to you. And if they're making sense to you, you will come to a very positive and a very strong conclusion. Principle number 1, seeing is not believing. And many people get this question who believe in Allah. They say, hey, well, if you believe in Allah, well, where is He? You know, you believe in the supreme being in the skies and in the heavens and all of these things. Why doesn't He show Himself? Have you ever seen Allah? Well, no one can see Him. Well, you can't see Him, then how can you know Him? Can you sense Him? Can you feel Him? Can you touch Him? Can you hear Him? No. Then how do you know? How can you tell? Well, there's a wrong argument. There's a wrong argument because we don't believe that seeing is believing. If you look at your cell phone, right? You don't see the waves coming out. You see the text message come to you, but you don't see it traveling. What do you see? You see the effect. You can measure the effect in the waves that go around. You can measure magnetic waves, but you may not be able to see them. You can see the radio frequencies that are coming out, but you may not be able to see them. You may have a dog whistle where you're blowing into it. You see the effect on the dog, but you can't even hear it yourself. It's a frequency that you cannot pick up. You can gauge infrared rays. You can gauge different, spectrums that you cannot actually perceive, but you can tell by the effects that they have. So number 1, we should not limit ourselves and say, well, if we can't see it, if we can't feel it, if we can't touch it, then we're not going to believe it. This argument should be removed from the minds of anybody. Fact number 2, something does not come out of nothing. People do not believe that something all of a sudden comes out of nothing. But there are people who have to defend their belief that Allah does not exist. They have to go and they say, well, something can come out of nothing. Professor Richard Dawkins, right? He makes this argument. He says that if you see a statue waving to you, it could possibly be, he's one of the world's famous atheists, He said it could be that all of the atoms traveled from one place to the other, and then they traveled back. Very low probability chance, but it's possible. Now, who's going to believe in that? Right? What kind of, imagine you were going to live your life like that. Imagine you had to live your life like that, believing that, oh, all of a sudden that just can't happen. You know what's going to happen to you? I want you to bring a practical example. Imagine somebody comes, throws a water balloon at you from the back. You're just walking by, all of a sudden, boom, you get hit with the water balloon. Right? You turn around, you look at the guy, he's got another one in his hand, right? You see the guy, he's got one more. You say, hey, what do you think you're doing, man? Why did you throw the balloon at him? I didn't throw it at you. So what do you mean? Just popped out of nowhere or something like that? It's possible. It's possible all of a sudden the atoms rearranged themselves and it just came. Or you know what? Maybe, you know, the balloon that I had, it was just sitting in my hand and all the atoms just happened to move in your direction. And it just went in your direction. And that's just, it's possible, right? You can't deny its possibility. Atoms have the ability to move. They have the ability to move around. Well, it happened. You would never live your life like that. You'd be like, come on, what are you playing around, man? Give me a break, man. Don't be throwing a water balloon at me. You wouldn't live like that. You wouldn't believe that. Imagine there were weapons happening, the same thing to you. Somebody shoots you, right? You turn around, the guy's got a gun in his hand. It wasn't me. Maybe the bullet just came out of nowhere, right? You never know. You don't live life like that. You don't live life like that. So if something does not come out of nothing, live your life in the principle, understanding that this stuff must have come from somewhere. The reality must have come from somewhere. Fact number 3. Examination reveals something about the designer. You examine something, it reveals some characteristics about the person who designed this. Right? Let's take a very simple example. You have a calculator. Right? We won't even get into computers. Much more complex. Just a simple calculator. You look at this calculator, and you test it, you see, oh, it can actually add, it can subtract, it's dividing, the numbers are coming out correctly. What do you know about the designer? You know that they must have had knowledge of mathematics, they must have knowledge of arithmetic at least. You look at the casing, it's got plastic, it's got buttons, they're in a proper order, they're there for a reason. What does it tell you? It tells you that the person who designed this had knowledge of plastics engineering. They know how to mold, they know how to do all of these things. Whatever you look at these things, it tells you characteristics about how it was designed and who designed it. It tells you something about their characteristics. So for example, you look at the human body, you look at the digestive system, look at how human beings eat, and then the food actually comes in a correct way through your body, you get the nutrients you need, the other stuff comes out, your waste comes out. And on top of that, you can just keep on analyzing, you know, your waste is biodegradable. Imagine if it wasn't, it would be waste all over the place. You guys would all get sick, you'd all die. Have a major, major problem. Right? You look at how the immune system works, for example. You look at all of these things, right? How they work, how they function in a specific thing, and you say, what does that tell you about the designer? The designer of these things, right, must have had quite a bit of knowledge, quite a bit of wisdom, quite a bit of understanding. In Islam, we have that in the Quran. Allah is Alim, He's the knowledgeable. Allah is Hakim, He's the wise. These attributes don't just come out of nowhere. They can be rationally justified when you go and you analyze the world. When you think about it, you can begin to understand these things. It's difficult. It's difficult to not see these things. You have to have a very, very good, propaganda, or information inside of your textbook, right, to be able to take you away from these things. You got to have a really good indoctrinated education to be able to miss these things. And this is why we miss these things. Number 4, believing in coincidence requires a leap of faith. This is what the answer many people give. They say, well, it could happen. Coincidence, maybe it just put itself together. We see sometimes, you throw some sticks on the floor, you throw them enough times, they'll form maybe like an image that looks like something. You keep throwing, you add more sticks, you keep throwing, throw it 1,000,000 times. Maybe you'll get some kind of figure or something like that. But taking it to that level, really, if you want to believe in that type of coincidence, that really requires a leap of faith on your part. Let us take an example. Everyone know what this car is? This is a Lamborghini, right? I know some people are, yeah, Lamborghini, right? I grew up with it too. It's a great car. Right? I mean, didn't grow up with the car. I grew up admiring the car. I grew up with the poster of the car, right? Great car, right? Now imagine somebody told you, well, this hurricane, this tornado came through the city, right? And it ripped up all these buildings, and it has all the equipment, it's sufficient amount of metal, sufficient amount of maybe paint somewhere in one of the buildings. All of a sudden it turned, twisted, took everything apart, and that's how this Lamborghini got assembled. Could you imagine? You say, well, let's try it again. Let's give them a million chances. Just a million times. Maybe it'll happen on the millionth try. You wouldn't believe it because the odds of it happening are so slim, it really, really requires a huge leap of faith to believe in something like this. So when you go and you look at something like this, you look at a microchip, you say, there's no way that's going to just form all of a sudden by itself. It's got to be designed. You look at the human cell, which you've all learned in biology. It's got the nucleus, it's got the ribosome, it's got the mitochondria, it's got all those functions, parts, they work together in such a structured and organized way, and then you have 1 trillion of them inside of your body, and then you're going to say that this may have just all of a sudden just come together somehow. Over long spans of time, somehow the forces of nature, through mutations, through this, through that, it just randomly happened. It could have happened. There's like some possibility. But you know what? The human being, they don't believe in possibilities. They believe in probabilities. If somebody comes to you and says, I have a business investment for you, there's a possibility that it could double your money, and there's a 0.001% of that. What do you think? You're going to invest? No, you're not going to invest. Somebody comes to you and says, well, I got 99% chance you're going to go and you're going to double, you're going to quadruple your money. Oh, my money's there. My money's there. So, continuing on this point, this brings up the story of Imam Abu Hanifa. Who's heard of Imam Abu Hanifa before? This is the founder of the Hanafi school of thought in Islamic law. So this is not the first time that Muslims and atheists have actually had a debate. This is something that's happened in the past as well. Imam Abu Hanifa, who was actually what's known as the second generation after the companions of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he had a debate with some atheists. And they told him, he said, okay, I'm busy right now, I'm going to meet you later on tonight. I'll meet you later on in the evening. I'll meet you across the river, and we're going to debate over there. He said, okay, fine. So the atheists, they're waiting. Imam Abu Hanifa is not coming. This guy is not showing up. And keep in mind, at that time, Muslims and Muslim scholars in that in particular, right, Muslims in general, when a Muslim says it's time, right, it's time. It's not like today's Muslim standard time. I know we need to get beyond that. Inshallah, by the grace of Allah, we will get beyond that. At that time, when you say you're going to be there, you're going to be there. So finally, Imam Abu Hanifa shows up late. You're like, what kind of Imam are you, man? You told us you're going to meet us here, and you make us wait for hours, and what's going on? I said, look, you're not going to believe what happened. I tried to cross the river, because there's a big river over there in the Iraq area. So I tried to cross the river, and guess what? There's no ferry. There's no raft to take me across. So I'm waiting, there's no boat. What do? He said, I waited, guess what happened? There was a tree over there, lightning struck the tree, the log fell inside the water, lightning struck a few times, tornado came, assembled a raft for me, I just jumped on, went across, I just got here. And they said, you expect us to believe a stupid story like that? He said, why not? You believe every single thing in this universe is the exact same way. So why wouldn't you believe? This is the argument of Abu Hanifa. Now let's look at some professors, modern day professors. Professor Ali Demirsoy, famous atheist Turkish professor, he says regarding life, the probability of the formation of a cytochrome C sequence, which is an enzyme that's very essential for life, is as likely as 0. The probability of the random formation of a cytochrome C sequence is as likely as 0, meaning it's almost 0%. It's like, you could say basically it's impossible, 0%. And then he says, but otherwise, if you don't believe in that part, some metaphysical powers beyond our definition should have formed this cytochrome C sequence. But if you accept that this metaphysical powers, meaning Allah, right? Meaning Allah made this. If you accept that, it's not appropriate to the goals of science. The goals of science. Therefore, we have to look into the first hypothesis. I asked you, what are the goals of science? If the goals of science are to look into something which has a probability of almost 0% chance, And then you're saying the opposite is almost 99.999% chance. Well, this is, if we look into this one, it's not appropriate to the goals of science. The science, we have to go with the one that's almost at 0%. That's somehow more scientific. If that's what science is, I don't understand the scientific method. I don't understand surveys. I don't understand statistics. I don't understand any of these things. If this is the logic, but that paradigm has to take precedence because people have their own beliefs. So if you think that simply a Christian or a Muslim or somebody goes and they perform research and all of a sudden they come out with some discovery that agrees with their religion, you say, oh, that's because of their religion interfered. But if someone who has no religion or someone who is atheist, we don't make the same accusation. Not realizing that that's also a position, it's also a religion. People's religious beliefs, yes, my Muslim beliefs may somehow affect, but my atheist beliefs, somebody else, may also affect the amount of research and the type of rhetoric that they have. The probability of the random formation of a single amino acid, which is a part of a cell, which you have 100 trillion in your body, is 1 in 10 to the 950th power. Like, you know when they say you're going to win the lottery? It's like 1 in a million. Let's say the lottery is 1 in a billion. Like, lotteries are not that much. It's 1 in a billion, man. You're not going to win the lottery. A billion has how many zeros? 9. This is 950 zeros across the board. There's not even a name for the number. That's one part of a cell. So imagine, you win, somebody wins the lottery every single day of the week, 7 days in a row. Let's say a whole month. They win the lottery every single day of the month, and the lottery is $5 million. How much money are they going to get from winning the lottery every single time? The entire month, every single day, they're going to get 0. You know why? Because they're going to be in jail, because they know they cheated. There's no way you're going to win the lottery. You wouldn't do that. When someone goes to Vegas and starts winning and winning and winning and winning, they realize, wait a minute, something's wrong here. Something's majorly wrong over here. This guy must be cheating. So there's an issue with this. So it requires a leap of faith. So to review, 4 principles. Fact number 1, seeing is not believing. Something does not come out of nothing. Examination reveals something about the designer, and coincidence is a leap of faith. Now let's respond to some of the common arguments that an atheist may bring up. Many of the questions, many of you may have these questions. I've had these questions. What are some answers? Number 1, there's multiple gods and religions. There's just so many out there. It's just too many, I just can't decide. How can you tell the difference? How do you know which one is right? There's just so many of them, and it's better just not to go with anyone. But what you don't realize is, atheism is one of those religions. It's one of those stances. You're taking a position. It's like I said before, it's not the default position. It's not, well, I'm just going to sit back and just relax and not do anything. You've taken a stance. Take an example. Bank robbery is taking place. You're standing there, right? And someone's happening, it's your friend maybe or someone like that. You decide, well, I could stop him, he's my friend, if I said something he might listen to me. Well, I can't, I'm just not going to take a stand. I don't know what to do. I don't know if he's right. The guy said, he needs it for his family. I'm just going to stand there. Take the same scenario. Imagine somebody's being raped, right? And it happens. Imagine somebody's being raped, and you just stand there. And you say, well, should I do something? Should I not do something? I'm just not going to take a stand. I know it's my friend that's doing it, but I'm just not going to take a stance. You've taken a stance by not doing anything. You've taken a stance. That's why they say with the people in terms of Holocaust, in terms of all the wars that take place, when you allow genocide to take place and you stand there and you do nothing, you've taken a position. You're not taking the default position, well, I couldn't make up my mind. No, you've taken a position. When a tornado comes inside your city, somebody says, tornado's coming. You say, well, I can't decide whether this guy is telling the truth or not. So I'm just going to keep thinking about it. You've taken a position. You either go or you stay. And if the tornado does come, you've made your decision, and you're there and you're gone. So you say, I'm going to play it safe. I'm not going to take a stance. That's a very big mistake that many people make. Number 2, belief does not matter. Many people argue, say, well, it doesn't matter whether you believe it. It's about me. Belief doesn't matter, right? They say, well, number 1, it does matter if it's true. You have to argue from the paradigm. So if it's true, the effects are going to be there in the afterlife. The effects will be there in the afterlife, number 1. Number two, morality in life will determine something big. Most people who are atheists or who do not accept Allah, they're not humanists by default. The vast majority are not. They don't all of a sudden become humanists. Dan may be a very nice guy because he's a humanist. I know he struggles for rights and all of these things, but that's not the vast majority of people. So what would life be like if you had a motivation that simply says, well, you know what? If somebody comes and puts $100 in front of me, right? What's my motivation to go and get it? Right? It makes being a believer in an afterlife makes a world of difference if you're a true believer. Don't make the argument there's so many bad people in religion and this and that. If you're a true believer, you have to accept the fact that that's going to motivate you to be a better person, become better in society. And we'll address the third argument later on, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum. Good evening, and thank everyone for coming this evening. I had such a good time last time. The discussions that we had afterwards, I'm hoping to have a lot more this evening. I want to thank Amir Murtaban for making this happen, and for Mustafa Umar, after seeing what I had to bring to the table a couple weeks ago, said, I think I could take this guy out.
Not in those words.
I want to thank my friend Richard Spencer for constructing the foundation and even the details of many of the arguments that I'm going to be employing this evening in a paper he put together called 15 Arguments for Atheism. Again, it's truly an honor to speak to you about such a taboo topic. I mean, does God exist, or does Allah exist? I really appreciate you being here, and hopefully we'll emerge from this evening more informed, more thoughtful, and with a deeper understanding of each other than previously. Since I've already presented in detail basically 9 of the 10 arguments that I had for you 2 weeks ago, this evening I'm going to present 4 new arguments, and then, if we have time, summarize the other 9 that I covered last time. Although I'm currently a truth-seeking atheist, since atheism doesn't say anything about what I do believe, only what I don't, I rarely refer to myself as such. And I think it might be useful, at least at this point, to distinguish between different kinds of atheists. There's what is termed a hard atheist, which would say there's absolutely no God, 100%. I don't find too many hard atheists that say 100% certain that there is no God. More people are soft atheists, like myself, that say, you know what, given all the evidence, given all the information that I've been exposed to, given the religious confusion, given the information that I'll present tonight, there's probably not a God. I don't think there's a God, and that's where I stand. I don't think there is, but I actually hope that there is, and we'll get to that. One of the young ladies last time I was here asked me, when did your exploration begin? When did you actually really asking the hard questions? And although I've always been seeking for answers, although I've always been searching for truth, there came a time when I was studying the Hebrew Bible as a Christian, because I was formerly a Christian for 12 years, 12 of the last 15 years. And I read a passage in the Hebrew Bible where Abraham questions God. Here's a righteous man. God was going to destroy, if you're familiar with the story, he was going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham looked at God and he said, wait a minute, God, you can't destroy the righteous with the wicked. That doesn't seem right. I thought, wow, here's a man that's willing to actually call God out on something that he believed God was doing wrong. He didn't just have the view that whatever God does, God's wise, so whatever he's doing, it makes, I'm just going to trust that it's good. He actually said, God, he says, will not the just judge of all the earth do what is right? And I thought, wow, here's a man that was questioning God's goodness. And then they have this dialogue where Abraham says, if there's 40 righteous people in the city, will you spare the city? And he says, I will. If there's 30 righteous people in the city, will you spare it? I will. If there's 10, I will. And that was very instructive to me, and it changed my approach to God. Whereas at one point, it was about subservience and about obedience and about, just whatever God says, I'm going to accept it, and I'm going to believe it, and I'm going to teach it. It took me out of that posture, and I said, if I'm going to be more like Abraham, I got to be very authentic. And if something doesn't seem right to me, I'm going to say, God, that doesn't seem right. And as I was reading my holy text, it was the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, I came across a lot of problems, a lot of issues that I thought, this doesn't seem right. Something does not seem right here. I hope tonight, when you listen to my arguments, you get the spirit of Abraham, you get the courage that he had, and you say, you know what? I have honest questions that I'm going to ask God, why is it like this? Is this really you? Did you really author this book? I'm going to be talking about the Quran later. I know it's a very taboo topic, but I plan to address some questions regarding that. I do want to live forever, and so even though I don't believe that God exists, I want God to exist, but I just don't think there's good reasons to believe that God exists. I want you to think about this. The absence of evidence is evidence of absence. The absence of evidence is evidence for absence. If you're going to your refrigerator and you said, you know what, do I have butter in my refrigerator? You're going to open up the refrigerator door and you're going to start looking for butter. And you're going to start pulling out each item piece by piece if you don't see it. And pretty soon, you can have everything in your fridge on the counter and you didn't find any butter. And so since there was no butter there, you conclude there must not be butter in my refrigerator. I think we could take the same approach regarding God. We can ask the question, does God exist? And we're going to search for him. We're going to look. We have the Hubble telescope now. We can look through our galaxy, and we've looked everywhere. And I think at some point, after a thorough search, we don't have to be conclusive and say 100%, but we can say after we've searched so much and asked all these questions, maybe God doesn't exist. The hypothesis, and I'm going to agree, that when you say, if I make the claim, there probably isn't a God, I'm going to provide some evidence tonight so that I think we can share that burden of proof, even though I have some questions that I'll talk about in my rebuttal. The hypothesis that offers the best explanation for the widest range of evidence is more likely true than other competing hypotheses. What I need to do is contrast the two competing hypotheses before us and determine which hypothesis better explains the available evidence. Hypothesis number one is that Allah exists, roughly defined as a spiritual being who is omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good, wise, and just, who is also the personal creator and sustainer of the world. Hypothesis number two, Allah does not exist. You will notice that my arguments this evening gain strength the more we suppose Allah is actively and continually involved in the world, while they lose strength the more we suppose Allah is unconcerned with the world. The reason for this is simple. A detached, indifferent God would leave little to no empirical evidence of its existence. Because the following arguments are evidentially based, they have little to say about a God that, for example, created the world to intentionally appear as if there is no God. That is, a God that is merely impersonal, a first cause, or a whimsical deist God who created the initial state of the universe and left everything else to chance. However, Allah, according to the Quran, is not indifferent, detached, or impersonal. The Quran describes Allah as the most gracious and the most merciful being in existence. Allah is portrayed as personal and active, promising, quote, "We will without doubt help our apostles and those who believe in this world's life and on the day when the witnesses will stand forth." 40, verse 51. So let's take a look at the world and see if an absolutely benevolent being is consistent with what we find. Here are 13 arguments or lines of evidence that I think are better explained by the absence of Allah than by the existence of Allah. The absence of Allah offers the best explanation for why believers need faith and non-believers do not. Non-belief does not require any information to be held by faith. I am free to follow the evidence wherever it may lead. When I do not have very much evidence, I do not have very much conviction. Where there are mysteries and things we cannot understand or may never know, I simply say, I don't know. Many Muslims, along with most religionists on the other hand, often have beliefs and faith in things that exceed the evidence they can provide. Moreover, Muslims and other religionists often feel the need to safeguard themselves against non-belief, feeling the need to nurture and foster faith. They do this by surrounding themselves with, mostly if not exclusively, with other believers, attending mosque or church regularly, engrossing themselves in religious literature, worshiping God, praying constantly, fasting, even burning secular music, which I, by the way, have done twice in my life. It is as if they have to constantly convince themselves of something they find hard to believe. The danger of slipping into doubt is often immensely threatening to the believer, or imminently threatening to the believer, because the world almost screams at us that there is no God governing the cruel realities we experience. Since many Muslims claim that faith is a necessary component for belief in Allah, then evidence and reason must necessarily be insufficient for holding belief in Allah. In other words, if there were great reasons and overwhelming evidence that Allah exists, why would we need faith at all? Some might claim that faith is unnecessary, but there is no straightforward, powerful argument for God's existence. All the classical theistic arguments are little more than fossils preserved in philosophy classes to see not if they fail, but how they fail. Furthermore, the vast majority of modern arguments for God's existence are entertained among experts today are downright complex and beyond the intellectual grasp of the average person, including myself. Is Allah merely trying to reach the intellectual elite? It seems unfair to curse the world's population to hell because one had to be an astrophysicist to make sense of it all. I conclude, since many non-believers desire God to exist, but cannot find good reason to believe, even when they try, sometimes for their entire life, and many believers have a notoriously difficult time preserving belief and resorting to nurturing faith, we have a compelling reason to suppose that non-belief is more reasonable since it does not require faith. Again, the absence of Allah offers the best explanation for why believers need faith and non-believers do not. The absence of Allah offers the best explanation for the physical dependence of minds on the brain. It is commonly assumed by those who believe in God that somehow connected to the body is an immaterial soul. The immaterial soul is often credited with our higher mental capacities, the ability to make free choices, think rationally, and even continue living after the death of our body. In short, we identify the soul as the source of our mind. Is there good evidence that such an immaterial soul exists? Unfortunately, there is not. Soul survival hypotheses are based on weak, questionable, contradictory, and maybe most importantly, culturally conditioned anecdotal evidence. Why is it that when Christians have near-death experiences, they see Jesus, Catholics encounter the Virgin Mary, Jews see dollar signs, New Agers see the light in the tunnel, and Hindus and Buddhists recall past lives? Why don't we have Buddhists that meet Allah at death? Why don't we have Muslims that become Buddhists because they realized they were on the brink of becoming extinguished in a Buddhist nirvana? Why don't we have a unified version of what happens? Something isn't right here. It appears that these experiences are internal, not external. Doctors talk about hallucinations that often happen at the onset of dying caused by oxygen deprivation, endorphin release, and random neural firings. Modern science demonstrates dependence of consciousness on the brain, verifying that the mind must die with the body. In other words, you need a brain to think, to have thoughts, experience awareness or consciousness. Humans, as do all animals, need eyes to see, ears to hear, a mouth to taste, and a nose to smell. Without these things, we do not have the capacity to experience anything. These are our senses. No senses, no sensations. There's some people that have had split brain patients, those who have undergone an operation that severs the corpus callosum to reduce epileptic seizures. This results in two mental systems, each with independent mental attributes. One patient complained that sometimes when he went to embrace his wife, his left hand pushes her away. Some people have brain pacemakers. They electrically stimulate the cerebellum in the brain of psychotics. A patient hearing voices commanding him to strangle his wife received one, and the voices disappeared along with his depression. The wires eventually broke and the voices returned. They fixed them, and he was back to normal. If under certain circumstances the mind cannot survive life, how can it survive death? Since it appears that there is no way that a mind can exist apart from a functioning physical brain to generate it, we are justified in drawing the inductive conclusion that disembodied minds do not exist. Moreover, we can connect all of this to the topic at hand and deduce that since disembodied minds most likely do not exist, that Allah most likely does not exist, since He is supposed to be a disembodied mind. The absence of Allah, therefore, offers the best explanation for the physical dependence of minds on the brain. The absence of Allah offers the best explanation for the problems of the Quran. If a good, gracious, and reasonable God is truly the author of the Quran, one should expect certain things. First and foremost, a heavenly text should contain the apex of moral instruction. It should be a guide that is able to delineate superbly just rulings on the most complex of ethical questions. A flawless text would not possess genuine contradictions. And it should have an existential fit, meaning its views regarding the world ought to generally correspond to humanity's collective experience of reality. I want to make it clear that my criticisms are not aimed at Muslims, but at the specific passages from the Quran that I find morally problematic. There is a tendency among those with faith commitments, including myself when I was a Christian, to do exegetical gymnastics in order to construe problematic passages in ways that are acceptable to the sensibilities of modern audiences. Although this is done to preserve the sacredness of a holy book, the moral authority of a God, and religious identity, it is often done at the expense of scholastic interpretive integrity. I do not feel this is honest or honorable to make a passage better or worse than it actually is in its historical context. Does the Quran possess the apex of moral instruction? We can consider the excessive earthly punishments that I mentioned last time. The Quran prescribes the cutting off of hands of someone who steals. Quote, "As to the thief, male and female, cut off his or her hands, a punishment by way of example from Allah for their crime, and Allah is exalted in power." This person could still use their teeth, elbows, or armpits to carry goods, right? So these kinds of violent, bloody prescriptions do not address root causes to theft, which are typically poverty, hunger, thirst, clothing, and other useful goods. Social stratification creates jealousy. If you have some people that own everything, and you have the vast majority of the people that are fighting over the little that's left over, that causes people to steal, because they're trying to get the little that's left over from the wealthy that own everything. Economic and social systems that condition people to take as much as they can for themselves, even at the expense of others. And I think this explains why even rich people sometimes steal. They've been conditioned to try to get as much as they can for themselves. But this is, of course, something that economic systems promote, our society promotes, especially in our current society, in capitalism. It's all about what you can get, as much as you can get, even if it's at the cost of the environment, even if it's at the cost of other human beings. We can look at the Quran in terms of women and sexual violations, which I mentioned last time as well. Quote, "If any of your women are guilty of lewdness, take the evidence of 4 reliable witnesses from among you against them, and if they testify, confine them to houses until death do claim them, or Allah ordained for them some other way." Although fornication, otherwise known as consensual sexual relations outside of marriage, is a victimless crime, that is, no one is hurt, even those who think it is wrong would mostly agree that condemning a woman to death via house arrest is cruel and unusual. Notice that this is only for women. Sounds like something a man would write, doesn't it? The woman and the man guilty of fornication, quote, this is another passage from the Quran, "The woman and the man guilty of fornication flog each of them with 100 stripes. Let not compassion move you in their case, in a matter prescribed by Allah, if you believe in Allah and the last day, and let a party of believers witness their punishment." The very next verse prohibits those guilty of adultery or fornication from marrying anyone except other guilty individuals and unbelievers. There's excessive punishments in the afterlife. Critics have charged that the Quranic doctrine of hell is, quote, "a divinely sanctioned sadism." And after reviewing its teaching on the subject, it is hard to disagree. Surah 4:56 says, "Those who reject our signs, we shall cast into the fire. As soon as their skins are roasted through, we shall change them for fresh skins, that they may taste the chastisement, for Allah is exalted in power, wise." Justice and punishment is one thing, but melting off the skins of human beings only to put new skins back on to do it all over again and again is quite another. Equally horrifying is Surah 22, which says, "But those who deny their Lord, for them will be cut out a garment of fire. Over their heads will be poured out boiling water. With it will be scalded what is within their bodies as well as their skins. In addition, there will be maces of iron to punish them, Every time they wish to get away from anguish, they will be forced back therein, and it will be said, taste the chastisement of burning. For those who question the veracity of the Quran, like me, Surah 40, 70 through 71 warns, they will have yokes and chains placed around their necks and dragged through stinky, boiling fluid where fire burns their bodies. Those who are thirsty will be given boiling water as hot as molten brass that will scald their faces and cut up their bowels to pieces. If boiling water, peeling skin, burning flesh, dissolving bowels, and crushing skulls with iron maces is not cruel and unusual punishment, what is? Anyone can say a God who enacts these kinds of tortures is most gracious, most merciful, just, and wise, but it will never make it true. The Quran has a bias towards men. Surah chapter 4, verse 34, gives husbands permission to physically strike wives suspected of ill conduct, stating, quote, admonish them first, next refuse to share their beds, and last beat them. But if they return to obedience, seek not against them the means of annoyance, for Allah is most high, great. Some have argued this is symbolic, but if the first two are literal actions, which they are, why would the third and final one be non-literal? Women were believed to cause ritual impurity when touched, requiring cleansing and forgiveness. Women were not viewed as reliable witnesses. To verify transactions regarding future obligations, 2 men were required, and if only one was available, 1 male and 2 female witnesses are called for, quote, so that if one of them errs, the other can remind her. According to Surah 2:28, males possessed a status above women. Slavery is deemed acceptable. Not only does the Quran make provisions for slavery, but Muslims are permitted to have sex with their slaves. The men are told to guard chastity, quote, except with their wives and the captives whom the right hand possesses. Muhammad was given special permission to marry as many women as he desired, including the authorization to have sex with the slaves of his choosing, quote, O Prophet, we have made lawful to you your wives, to whom you have paid their dowers, and those whom your right hand possesses out of the prisoners of war, whom Allah has assigned to you. That's chapter 33, verse 50. Instead of condemning the practice outright like the voices of the abolitionists, this dehumanizing practice is sanctioned and regulated. If there was a good and reasonable God, slavery would not be acceptable under any circumstances. Does the Quran possess genuine contradictions? Determinism and responsibility. According to the Quran, everything is predetermined. I remember watching a boxing match, and one of the boxers was a Muslim, and after the match, he got pummeled and he lost, and he said, it couldn't have happened any other way. This is what God wanted. It was in his plan. It was his decree. And I was really surprised by that. But when I read the Quran, Surah chapter 9, verse 51 states, say nothing will happen to us except what Allah has decreed for us. He is our protector, and on Allah let the believers put their trust. Surah 57:22 says, no misfortune can happen on earth or in your souls, but is recorded in a decree before we bring it into existence. This is truly easy for Allah. The implications are clear. Every Muslim who has ever been raped, molested, pillaged, or killed during the Crusades, burned during the Inquisitions, died of disease, starved to death, drowned during a tsunami, psychologically or emotionally abused in any way at any time was precisely what God wanted. It is not that God is merely allowing them to take place, but he wrote them down in a decree prior to them ever coming about. But then on the other hand, the Quran says that God tests his people. But why would God test his creations in real time if God already knows, in fact, has planned what they will choose beforehand? This sounds silly, even a bit sadistic, given the extent of pain and suffering in the world. If the end results are scripted beforehand, can trials genuinely be called tests? To deem something as an authentic test, does it not necessitate an open outcome? But then humans are held responsible. At the last day, during judgment, everyone will be held accountable, according to Surah 99, 6 through 8. These two claims, God's absolute control of every historical event and human responsibility, can only be stated, not reconciled. This is a genuine contradiction. Another one is the creation story. Surah 57, verse 37 states, he who created the heavens and earth in 6 days, and then he firmly established himself on the throne of authority. But in Surah 41, God creates the earth in 2 days, sets the earth's mountains and sustenance in 4 days, and finally completed the 7 heavens in 2. Adding them all together, this account appears to teach an 8-day creation. Apologists will call these apparent contradictions and conjure ingenious explanations. However, on the scale of probability, we ought not vie for the least probable explanation that is typically which is typically a forced explanation by those who feel the need to defend the Quran, but the most probable account given. Unfortunately, the eyes of faith often neutralize logic, reason, and evidence. Does the Quran have an existential fit? That is, does it fit our experiences? Does what it conveys about God line up with the experience of both believers and non-believers? The Quran promises help, as the verse I quoted earlier. We will, without a doubt, help our apostles and those who believe, both in this life and on the day when the witnesses will stand forth. However, there is no clear, observable, noticeable difference between the success, failure, or hardships of Muslims and of any other religious or non-religious people group. Muslims die of cancer, AIDS, heart disease, and car crashes in a way that is indistinguishable from every other religious or non-religious tradition. They suffer from Alzheimer's and economic peril all the same. Muslims, like other people, win some wars and lose others. Many Muslims, along with other religious and non-religious people in the world today, suffer the heavy hand of Western hegemony. Again, religious history shows no unmistakable signs of guidance, protection, or help. The absence of Allah offers the best explanation for poor designs and the flaws of evolution. 99% of every species that has ever existed is now out of existence. Think about that. 99.9% of every species that have ever existed is now out of existence. What kind of designer would design something where 99% of every species that has existed would go out of existence? Considering that statistic, is it really conceivable that evolution is being directed by an intelligent or competent or personal agent? Is it really conceivable, as Christopher Hitchens says, that heaven sat idly by as our species came onto the scene roughly 98,000 years ago, and then watched us struggle, suffer, children mostly dying during childbirth, others living about 25 years, dealing with famine, bitterness, war, misery, and only 3,500 years ago think, that's enough of that, it's time to intervene. And the best way to do this would be by more death, requiring animal sacrifice, and giving private messages through angels somewhere in the less developed parts of the Middle East? It's unspeakable. Evolution possesses poor design. Hundreds of animals die at birth. They don't even get a chance at life. They die at birth. Some species eat their own young. Fish, for example, eat their own young. Some fish eat their own young. Spontaneous natural abortions are numerous and widespread. We call them miscarriages. 1 out of 10 women throughout history without the aid of modern medicine have died during childbirth. The large human brain needing a larger skull to house it, combined with too narrow a birth canal, is the culprit for many mothers dying during childbirth. 2/3 of women in Malawi today die during and soon after birth. There is no more room for our wisdom teeth. Why is that? As Dr. Mark Myers of Chaffey College had mentioned during a debate last year, when humans stood up, it was like standing up the Golden Gate Bridge, and we bear the pain and soreness in our backs today. And why can't we produce vitamin C like other animals? Nearly all mammalian species have this ability. The absence of Allah offers the best explanation for the physical forces that cause natural disasters. We can talk about earthquakes, floods, avalanches, blizzards, cyclones, droughts, famine, heat waves, storms, tornadoes, tsunamis, volcanoes, and even lakes kill people through something called limnic eruptions. Putting it all together, just since the first century, well over 180 million have died of natural disasters. Remember, we can't blame human free will for natural disasters. Why do they happen? Why are they there? We know that they don't need to exist because in your own tradition you believe in a place called paradise where there's not going to be volcanoes and tornadoes and tsunamis killing hundreds of thousands of people. So it's possible. So why do we have to live in a world? And those things are not our fault. Surely if Allah exists, the death and devastation caused by natural disasters is absolutely baffling. But if he does not exist, such natural disasters are no less tragic, but at least we can explain them. They're the products of mindless forces like plate tectonics, tropical weather systems, operating in a universe blind and indifferent to our struggle for survival. Thus, the pitiless forces that produce natural disasters are strong evidence for the absence of Allah and against the existence of Allah. The absence of Allah offers the best explanation for tumors, genetic disorders, mutations, diseases, illnesses, and infections. Consider people with 50-pound tumors growing out of their faces, or people who are dying and have died of AIDS, tuberculosis, bubonic plague, influenza, malaria, measles, smallpox. There's over 1,060 million deaths from these things. We haven't even touched on the millions that die from lower respiratory infections, tetanus, meningitis, syphilis, yellow fever, the typhoid fever. The absence of Allah offers the best explanation for the presence of excessive, unjustified, and gratuitous pain and suffering in the world. I'm not talking about the pain we can learn from, like when you touch a hot stove and you can learn something, or when you get a root canal and you have to, it's painful, but it's for a better cause. There is no way that a God who, according to a saying of Muhammad, is more merciful to his creatures than a mother to her child, would allow needless anguish like the intolerable pain felt by most people suffering from terminal advanced cancer. If Allah exists, then gratuitous pain and suffering cannot. There must be some ultimate justification, but He hasn't shared it with us. In contrast, if Allah does not exist, we have an explanation. The sensation of pain evolved naturally as our body's way of warning us when something's wrong. But since evolution isn't a thoughtful and considerate process, it never figured out a way to turn the pain off when there was no more need of warning. Thus, the absence of Allah is compatible with unjustifiable pain and suffering, and because unjustifiable pain and suffering exists, the existence of a gratuitous suffering in the world is evidence for the absence of Allah and against the existence of Allah. I'm going to conclude now and maybe mention some of my other arguments. Well, you've already heard them, so you can go refer back to the first debate. But I'm just going to conclude. To conclude then, the absence of Allah offers the best explanation for why believers need faith and non-believers do not. The physical dependence of minds on the brain, for the problems of the Quran, the poor designs and flaws of evolution, the physical forces that cause natural disasters, for tumors, genetic disorders, mutations, diseases, illnesses, and infections. It offers the best explanation for the presence of excessive, unjustified, gratuitous pain and suffering. It offers the best explanation for the silence of God in the face of adversity, the hiddenness of God, the ordinariness of religious history, religious confusion, predation, and hostility in the universe towards life. In essence, the idea that Allah exists must create cognitive dissonance by asserting attributes of God that make it absolutely no sense given the data we have about life on this planet. I am compelled to ask, if this isn't what a world would look like if there was not a God, what is? Thank you.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of God, the compassionate and merciful. I'm going to begin my argument by making fun of Dan's hat, actually. Showing that, my hat is actually much better, it's more comfortable, it just makes more sense than his hat. It looks just strange and it looks weird. Right? The reason why I'm saying that is because the vast majority of Dan's presentation was what I call the Yo Mama argument. Right? It has nothing to do with actually the topic. You can sit there and you can talk about morality in the Quran, you could talk about, well, this verse doesn't seem to make sense, but the topic here is not about my mom or your mom or my dad or your dad, it's about does Allah exist? Now you may feel that that somehow has some potential here, but that's not the topic. We can always debate this topic, we can go through it. And, we discuss this on a regular basis in interfaith sessions. Pastor Luke is over there. We've discussed this on numerous occasions. He's come into my office. But let's try to focus and stick on the topic, okay? So I'll answer a few of your things, and then I'll get into part of my rebuttal. We just threw out, just a ton of things out there, but thank God we have a long Q&A session, so we can answer all of those things. First of all, Abraham questioning God for destroying Sodom and Gomorrah. I'm not sure about the biblical account, but the Quranic account, when Abraham is questioning, what he's questioning is he's trying to understand the wisdom. When a prophet asks a question, he's trying to understand the wisdom, and when he got the answer, he realized he was content. So the Abrahamic thing doesn't necessarily apply, at least from a Muslim perspective. The absence of evidence and the Hubble telescope and everything, I've already addressed this in my thing about seeing is not believing, yet we're still talking about the Hubble telescope. We're still talking about, well, let's find him, let's use our technology. Again, it's right there in front of us. And this is what Imam Ghazali used to say. He said, if you're searching for something that's in front of you, you're never going to find it. It happens to me with my glasses all the time. It's here, you're looking, where are my glasses, you can't find it because they're right in front of you. The concept of absolutely benevolent, I'm going to address that right now. Just keep in mind this term, absolutely benevolent, and you'll understand why I'm going to talk about it. Simply say, I don't know, I'm going to skip that. Classical philosophical arguments that are beyond the grasp of the average person. You notice that I did not bring up anything like ontological argument, did not bring up anything like all these other, different arguments that, are used in the philosophical realm that vast majority of people have a difficult time understanding. Even I have a very difficult time understanding. The arguments that I made, the 4 principles that I brought were so clear, I believe the vast majority of people clearly understood it, and they're like, that's obvious, that obviously makes sense. It's a nomad in the desert who's a Bedouin who doesn't even have an education could come to the same conclusion. In fact, I was writing an article one time. It was the Western philosophers versus the Bedouin, showing that it's such a simple belief, actually, that a Bedouin who's just looking around, when he sees footprints in the sand, well, that means that there's a camel that went through here, right? There's some evidence here. That's how you tell, right? Something must have taken place. So it's actually quite simple. It's not that difficult. I'm not talking about ontological arguments. I'm not talking about the Kalam cosmological arguments and all of that. I'm talking about the basic things that we talked about. The proof of the soul. You mentioned, what happened to my laptop? Okay. The proof of the soul. Now, one of the things that Dan argued was, well, can you prove, regarding the soul, and there's this theory and that theory. This has nothing to do with the topic again. In the Quran, it says that, يَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الرُّوحِ. They ask you about the soul. They say the soul is from the command of my Lord. You have not been given much knowledge about it. No one goes and says, well, prove that the soul exists. We're talking about proof that Allah exists, and from there, the rest of it all comes from the Quran. And then that's a separate issue. We're just talking about the belief in Allah. Near-death experiences, I know that's very, interesting in terms of movies and, flatliners and all of these, type of things that are happening. This also has no basis in Islam. We don't say, well, because one person had a near-death experience, therefore now I'm believing in Allah. That's not the point. It's something that can do for your own personal belief, but it doesn't apply to anybody else, right? So therefore the belief has to be universal. Now let's get to what Dan addressed in the end of his presentation, and he addressed it in his previous presentation with Hamza. God does so many bad things. Allah does so many bad things. There's so much evil in the world. How do we understand this? Why is there so many problems? Why are there people born this way? Why is there the earthquake? Why all these things happen? And when people bring up this argument, they feel like they found this Achilles heel. They feel like they found this weakness. Oh, no believer cannot, we're stuck now, we have no answer. And many Muslims, if they're not familiar with this, and the reason why you're not familiar with it as a Muslim is because you've not actually received any Islamic education. And I had not received any Islamic education, so I had no answer, I had no idea. But the basic child going through a basic Islamic education in the golden ages of medieval Islam would have detailed answers. This would not affect him at all. I just want to make it very clear to the Muslims in the audience, as well as myself, the fact is that you did not get a proper Islamic education. May Allah help us in fulfilling that part over here in our mosque and in our community. But, first thing, evil is not the norm. You see this destroyed building, and you see this picture, and you see all these things, shock value, right? Oh, it's horrible. It is horrible. It's really horrible, right? Somebody dies, somebody's killed. Shock value is horrible. It is horrible. But why do you have the shock? Why is there that shock value? It's because it's not happening on a regular basis. If you walk down the street, right outside of our mosque, we see a dead body on the floor, everyone's going to be, oh my goodness, Ya Allah, how could something like this happen? But if it was happening all the time, everywhere you go, you walk to your car, oh, a dead body over there, it happens all the time. Oh, a woman getting raped over there, this is normal. This is something that happens all the time. Oh, you're about to walk to your car, oh, my neighbor's car just got blown up. This is normal, this kind of thing happens. You wouldn't have the shock value. So first of all, evil is not the norm, right? It's not the norm in the community. The norm is balance. The norm is order, and that's why there's that shock value. That's why when you look at the cup, subhanAllah, that's why when you look at the cup, the atheist is a pessimist. The cup is 99% full, and what do? They look, oh, but there seems to be 1% missing, and you're actually looking from a distance, because it may not be as you see. Looking from a distance, it looks like there's 1%, someone brings you a big pitcher, here's a gift for you. Why is there 1% missing? Because you want to focus. Like a pessimist, you want to focus on just the bad parts. Now, we don't shoot the judge. When the judge goes and does something to somebody, do we say, oh, this person went and, you put this person in prison? You don't go and shoot the judge. You don't start blaming them because they've done something. So when we're talking about hell, we're talking about paradise. So, oh, this person did something bad. Oh, how could he do something like that? What kind of merciful person is this? What is this? What is that? It's not going to work. Our source of morality is above and beyond this life. So people who are so scared of death, death is not the end all in Islam. So it's not about if somebody dies, well, that's so horrible, it's this and that. If you look at a cow, morality is relative. If you eat a hamburger, it's great for you. People are waiting for a halal In-N-Out burger to come out. Great burger, right? Good for you, you feel so good. Really bad for the cow, right? The morality, good and bad, has a sense of relativism to it. So the reason why murder is bad in the first place, it's because you're violating the rights of another being. You see, you're violating the rights of creation. That's how Allah has defined it. He does not go and fit into the exact same category as morality as we do. Now, next thing. If you have a test, remember, life is a test according to Islam. If you have a test and you're in the middle of your test and you're taking it and all of a sudden you're getting stressed out, I didn't study properly, what am I going to do, what am I going to do, this and that. You don't start yelling and shouting and screaming at the teacher, I hate you, you're so stupid, this and that. That's exactly what the atheist is doing. They see something wrong, something they can't answer, something they can't deal with. Oh, I got sick, someone got cancer, someone got this. It's a test from Allah, you deal with it. But you get all emotional. Oh, why? Why did this have to happen? And we know that same people who have good wisdom, they don't answer questions when they're in a state of anger. They don't make decisions when you're in a state of anger. What did they say? Calm down first, before you make a conclusion. When people make that conclusion, why did this have to happen? You shouldn't open your mouth yet. Calm down and then think about it, and then you're going to have a better answer. There's a logical fallacy, and I'll end with this. The logical fallacy here is, if God is good, or like he said, absolutely benevolent, which we don't say absolutely benevolent, we say most merciful. If God is good, there would be no problems in this world. But there are problems in this world. Therefore, either God is bad, or God does not exist. Either Allah is bad, or Allah does not exist. This is logic, right? It's a logical argument to say everything's fine. But here's the problem. There's a false assumption in number one. And the false assumption is that that Allah would do every single thing and prevent every single problem that He possibly could prevent. So if you say, if my teacher is nice, then my teacher would give me the answers to the test while I'm taking it. But my teacher didn't give me the answers. I asked him, give me the answer. He didn't give it. Therefore, either my teacher is not nice, or my teacher just doesn't exist. We would not use this reasoning and this mentality. My time up? My time's up, so. Dan, you ready? Come on up.
All right, Assalamu alaikum. So, I actually have a hat like that. Next time I'll wear it. I think it's ironic that you actually said that I presented no evidence that God does not exist, when I felt like you didn't actually, you said a lot of nice things. You said about your personal experience. You talked about misconceptions that some believers have about needing faith and stuff, but I didn't actually hear any evidence that a God exists, much less that Allah exists. I would like to know some evidence that Allah exists. I mean, how do we, if there's, I mean, as far as maybe you got with maybe one argument, which is that there's a, I'll say right here, something does not come out, no, I agree with that. Examination reveals something about a designer. This is called basically circular reasoning. The conclusion is actually contained in the premise. In other words, that you're assuming that there's a designer automatically. Examination reveals something about the designer. But I mean, if we look at, for instance, a snowflake, it looks like it has a designer, doesn't it? I mean, it's beautiful, probably one of the most beautiful things you've ever seen. It has intricate detail. But what created the snowflake? Is God making, cutting out little origami things and dropping them to earth? No. How about a diamond? Probably the second most beautiful thing that you've ever seen. Is there a designer to the diamond? We know how diamonds are made. We know the processes, the mountains, the pressure, the heat that creates these things that upon examination you would automatically want to say, well, something must have designed that. But there could be natural processes that can design amazing things. He said that seeking or seeing is not believing. But we need something, right? He said that we can't hear, we can't see, we can't smell, we can't touch. If we can't do any of those things, what do we have? We have nothing. At least with like the cell phone, you can hear the words coming out of it. If we have the right, we've created all kinds of different machines that could detect certain waves that we know are flying through the sky because our televisions, come on when we used to have those little antennas on top of them, and the television works, we see it. We can detect these radio waves and TV waves and so forth. So there's something there. But when it comes to God, if we can't use our eyes, our ears, our nose, our mouth, or anything, then what do we have? We have nothing. We have no indication. And that's what it is. And I think I want to say that it's good that you're saying that we don't need a leap of faith, but why do we need faith at all? We shouldn't need faith. If God was that obvious, we wouldn't need faith. And as far as the burden of proof is concerned, I think it does largely fall on the person who makes the claim. If I was to tell you there's green Martians on the moon drinking green tea right now, who has the burden of proof? I want you to give me evidence that there's no green Martians living on the moon drinking green tea right now. Give me evidence. Prove to me that there's not green Martians. Prove it to me. I want some evidence.
You mention it, you prove it.
So I think the person that makes the claim, that person, the burden of proof falls on the person making the claim. Believing in coincidence requires a leap of faith. Believing in coincidence requires a leap of faith. I don't think this is the case. The chance of winning the lottery is really, really, really small. But someone's going to win it. Right? And we don't need a leap of faith to believe that somebody won the lottery. And that's the way it is with our planet, just being at the right place, just far enough from the sun, so that we're not burned up. And we're not too far where everything's frozen. We just landed in just the right place. But there's no constant. It's not like our Earth is going to always be in this perfect place. Eventually the sun's going to expand and it's going to come to heat death. Right? So, and I also want to say something about him misrepresenting evolution. It's not that there's a storm and a raft appears and wow, there's a raft, the storm created it. Evolution says these changes took place by random mutations, and it took millions and millions of years. It's a very slow process. It's not overnight that we get these kinds of things. I think it was a misrepresentation as far as the illustration he gave you with the gambler who's gambling, and he keeps gambling, he keeps winning. And we're led to believe that, if you gamble and you pull the lever and you win, that your chances of winning the next time are less. In other words, if you were to have a penny in your hand, you were flipping it. What are the chances that you flip the penny and you get heads, you flip it, 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 you get heads. Let's say on the 50th time you've gotten heads. What's the chances that the 51st time you flip it, you're going to get heads? 50-50, right? The percentages haven't changed. So even though we were led to believe that it's totally improbable and it will impossible because it's landed on a head so many times, it's always going to be 50% every time that we flip that coin. regardless of how many times you've done it before. And he said that you've taken a stance by not doing something. You've taken a stance by not doing something. And I would say, yes, I agree with that. Why is it that God doesn't do anything? If there are 12 armed officers and a woman is brutally raped and murdered, and the officers have these guns, they could have stopped it, but they didn't. They went up to her and said, you know what? We saw it happening, but we were just testing. We were just testing you. This is a trial for you. We wanted to see what you would learn from the experience. We would say, those officers are cruel and unusual. So if we're demanding that people intervene when they can and when we have the potential, we have to be fair, and we can't have a double standard. We have to say God should intervene too, because he could intervene much better than we can in every circumstance. He says that beliefs do not matter. And I agree with you that beliefs do matter. And I think as far as the afterlife, should we believe just because we're going to be punished in the afterlife or be fearful or scared? I would say we shouldn't just think about the afterlife. We should think about what's right. And the first question should always be, is God good? And until we're convinced that God is good, we shouldn't automatically want to go to where God is. Maybe we should want to go to a place far, far, far away from the God if God isn't good. So I think that's an assumption that most believers make automatically. And they don't even allow for the option. In fact, you mentioned Abraham just saying, is there wisdom in this? And I say, yes, ask that question. Is there wisdom in this? And what happened with me is that I didn't get an answer where Abraham realized that there was God spoke to him and told him why he was, basically there were no righteous people in the city, but he had an answer. So he could move forward and believe that God was good because his questions were answered. But with me, I didn't hear any voice. I didn't get an answer. And so until we have an answer, we can't automatically just say and presume that God is wise and he knows best and that whatever God does is okay. We have to demand answers. And until we get those answers, then we can move forward. Then we can, once we realize that, whoa, there were no righteous people, now I can say God's wise. He's good. But we don't have those answers. Morality, belief does affect this life as well as talking about morality in this life. And this is one thing that I found curious just in my observations of my own Christian friends largely, but I think it can apply to Islam as well, that when you have the belief that you're going to live in a paradise after this earth, I think it takes away the incentive to fight for your rights and justice and peace and security and all that this life has to offer now. Because if you believe that it's going to come then, that could encourage you to say, well, I'm not going to get out of this life what I want, so I'm just going to pray, I'm going to wait for the time when I'm dead, and then I'll go to a good place. But if this is all that there was, wouldn't we be all the more inspired to try to make this experience as good as it could possibly be? We wouldn't allow corrupt leaders to get away with the lying and stealing and hoarding the wealth. I mean, in this country alone, 91% of this population owns 95% of the wealth. But hey, if we have if Jesus is going to come and destroy the earth and make it new, or if Allah is going to take us to another place after we die, then who cares? We'll put up with it for 50, 60 years, and then we'll get what we want later. But if there isn't something later, maybe there isn't something later. Maybe it's just a maybe. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. I would say our best bet is to act as if there isn't a God, to try to demand justice now, peace now, freedom now. Mustafa says evil is not the norm. I would beg to differ. You've been to 45 countries. South America, the exploitation, the poverty, the death rates, the occupation, United States working through corporations to exploit their resources. Go to Afghanistan and tell me there's not death and turmoil every single day. Go to Iraq, go to the West Bank. You go all over the planet. The vast majority of the people, actually more than half of the population, lives on less than $2 a day. $2 a day, and you're telling there's not suffering and distraught and pain and suffering and turmoil on a daily basis for most people's lives. We're living in the heart of the empire here in the United States. Sure, we can go out and walk, our dogs at night. Sure, we can, go to Denny's or go to Applebee's or go have a nice dinner somewhere. We are in the heart of the empire. We're getting the scraps from the most wealthy people on the planet. So it's easy to say that, everything's great here in the United States, here in Corona, California. But if you travel, you see something entirely different. And I think Mustafa knows that. And I think once we do calm down and think about it, we'll realize something's not right. something is not adding up. Even if I'm not experiencing great turmoil right now, I can calm down and still look at the universe and say, there probably isn't a God. Thank you.
Once again, thank you to both of our speakers. And thank you to the audience. Give yourselves a hand as well. I know you guys have been sitting here for an hour and a half. Why don't y'all just get up and stretch for a second, and we'll begin our Q&A session right away, but go ahead and take 30 seconds to stretch out a little bit. Okay, our first question is to Imam Mustafa. The question is from the audience, do you reject the existence of randomness? Do you reject the existence of randomness?
No, I don't reject the existence of randomness. I don't reject the possibility of coincidence. If I see somebody in the supermarket and I was just thinking about them and all of a sudden they just popped in there or something like that, I don't, if somebody said, well, that's a great coincidence. Yeah, it's no problem, it's a coincidence. What I reject is when the probability becomes so impossible to actually believe, like somebody winning the lottery every single day for an entire year, then yeah, I'm not going to believe that, because the average person will not believe it. The law would not believe that. You would not go and take those odds. So when the odds are infinitely against you, in terms of believing in probability and coincidence, I would not believe in that.
Professor Dan, if you do not believe in a quote-unquote higher power that will reward and or punish you, then what would anyone's motivation in life be? In other words, who's to stop a complete anarchy occurring in this world? What is there to live for?
It's a good question, and the way that I would answer that is, if I'm not, I think the one view about living life on the basis of pain and punish, or some kind of rewards or punishment, is actually like a kind of childish morality in a sense. We're scared of our we're going to do right because our parents are going to maybe put us in the corner or discipline us in some way. But as we mature, as we grow older, we start to see why we should act certain ways. We actually see the reasons behind the punishments and the rewards. And so I don't think that we should be operating now as adults on the basis of being scared of being punished by God or rewarded by God. I think that we should look into the world and see what is the way to create the greatest amount of happiness for all of us, for every sentient creature. And I'm not even talking about just humans. Other sentient beings like animals, cows, pigs. I think every sentient being has its own interests. And what I've experienced is that when I make you happy, you make me happy. And there's like this circle of happiness that we can create. And so I would say that my goal, what to live for, I want every human being on the planet to have healthy, cruelty-free food.
Liberty, not everyone thinks that. Like, not everyone has that idea.
Let's let the speakers respond, please. We'll try to follow up sessions after.
I want every human being on the planet to have healthy, cruelty-free food, housing, health care, pure air, water. I think pollution should be totally illegal. Why would we pollute the air when we're breathing that? The EPA says there's 65,000 people that die every single year because of air pollution. Why don't we outlaw it completely? No amount of air pollution should be acceptable. This is the planet that we have. We need to take care of it. We need to take care of each other. And the end result is we'll all be happier. And I would say that there's a basis to ground all of this, which is in our biology. One thing that you and I share, even though we have different religious perspectives and views about God and the afterlife, is that we all have the same, or at least a similar, for the most part, biology. We have the same desires for food, for water, for shelter, right? Those things are in common. And so I think we could, there might be someone, as you were saying, that's not like that, that wants to harm, to hurt, to maim. I think we need to, extricate them from our society, and put them in a place where we're safe and they're safe. I don't think that we should whip them and beat them and kick them and torture them in any way. I think they need to live a different kind of existence, a separate existence from us, in some kind of, well, they would have to. I mean, and I would say that it's not. I'm not going to go there for right now, but I think I've answered the question sufficiently.
Do I get to respond, or can we respond back and forth to these or something? With that? Like,
yeah, let's do that.
Could we do that, like on every question you get one?
Yeah.
Is that fine?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so from the Islamic perspective, Dan's position sounds very nice, and I think it's better than the people who are abusing the planet, much better. But at the same time, I feel like it's an extreme position. It's an extreme position because your concept of what this world is and the position of each and every single person is quite different from Islam. See, Islam puts the human being at the center. So, for example, if you were to take your analogy or your mentality to its extreme, technically plants are living beings as well.
Yeah.
And you're actually killing and eating those living beings. Right? So, I mean, it's like taking someone, for example, like a human being, and the human being, for example, you say, well, the human being doesn't have eyes and it doesn't have hands, and therefore it's handicapped, and therefore there's a different type between a human cell and a plant cell, yet you're still killing that, And in terms of pollution and all of these things, we believe in Islam that there's the status of a human being, that the world was created for us. Not created for us to abuse, of course. These people are horrible that are doing that, but created first for us to use, but within limits, within bounds, and not to destroy it. So we have many beliefs on the same level in terms of no pollution and all of that, but at the same time, like for example, we cannot take it to such an extent where we say, well, we're never going to use cars, and we're never going to make clothes because it results in pollution, and we're never going to eat, plants, or what are we going to eat then? We'll end up dying. So basically, I just wanted to reiterate that the position in Islam, the human being, is at the center of creation. And when you realize that this world was created for the human being, the entire paradigm is put into perspective.
Can I respond to that?
Do we just do response back and forth?
You know, one more response. Go ahead.
Sure.
Okay, yeah, that's fine.
I mean, I think I would make a distinction between killing life, which I agree. If I was to eat a plant, and I do eat plants, I'm a vegan, so I only eat plants and legumes and rice and beans and fruits and vegetables, and I'm very proud to do so. But there's a distinction between life and sentient life. What I said is we should take in the entrance of sentient life, meaning life that has a central nervous system, life that can experience pain, life that can experience pleasure, and that's very different, I think. And so, and I don't think that, why not make cars that are run by the sun, or why not, there seems to be so many, we can utilize our technology if we really wanted to transform the planet. We wouldn't have to pollute. I don't think it's an either or, that we're here just for ourselves. But I think I think we can take care of both humans and other sentient beings. And if I can live happy and healthy without harming another sentient being, why not? Why not?
Okay, next question is addressed to Imam Mustafa. Mustafa, you described how you can tell something about the designer from the creation. The question is, how do you describe the creator when some of its creation do not have specific function? Would you say he is imperfect? Is it a result of evolution?
So in terms of, if you look at a creation or you look at something which does not have a particular function, or actually I guess this is talking about, for example, vestigial organs. So vestigial organs in the sense that, well, we have these teeth, we have this appendix, we have, et cetera, which doesn't seem to play any function. One of the things that we notice is that in science, like in the beginning of the 20th century, there was about 97 vestigial organs in the human being on the list. And every single year kept going, that list got smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until they ended up with like 3 or 4. And even now the 3 or 4, there's many theses being written about the fact that the appendix, despite the fact that it does something in another animal differently, the appendix actually does have a function. It does serve a function. And if you go and you ask your biology professor, does it serve a function? Yes, he will give you answers. In fact, I was in a debate once, a professor came to me and said, well, I am a professor in biology, and it does serve a function. So going back to what Dan said before, is that you have to be willing to say, I don't know, right? You leave it up to Allah. This is what Muslims do. When you realize that, well, all of these other things have a function. Every single thing has a function. Our list of 100 things in the beginning of this, last century said that, oh, well, we have no idea. So we started forming all these theories and theses and all of that. And now all of a sudden the list goes smaller, 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 almost at zero. What should we learn from that lesson? We learn that the problem is not the body. The problem is us. The problem is our own limited understanding. And that's why we have this term, we have this statement in Islam. We say, Allahu A'lam, that Allah knows best. And we realize that we have a good reason for believing that Allah knows best.
Definitely.
Well, I think what I would say is it's not just about vestigial organs. There's 99.9% of every species that have ever existed are out of existence. So why? I mean, if humans are the centerpiece of creation, why don't we get to experience all of those species? 99.9% of every species. And there's also hundreds of animals die at birth. Some species eat their own young. We have spontaneous natural abortions are numerous, like miscarriages. There's no more room for our wisdom teeth. Our backs hurt. I mean, there seems to be so many problems with the design. I think we could deduce from this information that there's some, if the design is flawed in some way, which it seems to be, there would be some flaw in the designer if one existed. But I don't think that's the case.
We'll do maximum of 3 responses per question. So we'll leave it at that. But we can go all night otherwise. So I think the whole thing about experiencing the different animals and stuff like that. I mean, maybe you would play with them. Maybe we would make burgers out of them or something like that. Try and, But the thing is, I don't see why that's important at all in terms of experiencing. Again, if we look at from an Islamic perspective, is that everything is created for us. So if these animals existed, and then they went out of existence, Allah knows that there's no need, there's no necessity for us to, okay, we missed out playing with the Tyrannosaurus Rex. I didn't get an opportunity to have my pet T-Rex or something like that. And that's not really, a big deal. That's not really a major thing. So in terms of all of these other problems, these other issues that result, what is the cause? We're still trying to figure out what's the cause of this disease. We don't know. We don't know. And then sometimes we figure it out. We say, oh, it's because human beings were doing this. Oh, what's the problem? What's the cause that this meat became bad? Oh, well, we were feeding the cow its own dung. Or we were feeding the cow, actually we kind of grinded them up. And, the cow is not a carnivore, right? It eats plants, and then we go and we feed it, and we get mad cow's disease. So we have all these problems. Most of these problems we figured out, the vast majority, because we did something stupid. Because we did something wrong. And then when we see something else, we can't figure it out. Rather than blaming on Allah, why did you have to do this? Maybe we could actually humble ourselves and say, well, maybe we did something stupid again. Astaghfirullah, may Allah forgive us. That's what the Muslim perspective is.
Dan, you talked so much about pain in your presentation. You can only sense or feel pain. Can you see pain? How would you respond to that?
I see pain every time I turn on Al Jazeera. Literally. I mean, obviously I can't see if I look in the mirror, if I'm experiencing pain, I can see pain in that sense. But so I guess it depends on what you mean by, can you see pain? Because obviously we can look in, in our own travels and our own experiences. Whether it was my friend Steve, who had a brain tumor right out of high school, and I had to witness him wither away and become what looked like to me a Holocaust victim. His legs were literally about that thin, and he became unconscious. He was just laying there, and I was a Christian at the time, so I was praying and praying for God to do something to heal him, to help him, but nothing happened. So I experienced a great amount of pain, and he experienced a great deal more pain, having to suffer through this cancer. My father died at age 11. I experienced a great amount of pain. So, could I see pain? I don't really understand what the question is getting at. But obviously, like I said, when I look into the world with my own eyes, I see pain experienced by others. A significant amount of it.
Okay, let's see. Also addressed to Dan, as most of these are, but a lot of these, of course, Imam will have an opportunity to also give the Muslim perspective or the Islamic perspective. Dan, you said diamonds are made through natural process, so who's controlling nature?
I guess when you ask the question, who is controlling nature, you already have the conclusion wrapped up in what the answer is, right? Because you're looking for a name of a person. But I don't know anyone who's controlling nature. All we can do is look at the way that nature works. And as it seems like we've established, we see that the way that nature works, and that's as far as we can get. I mean, I'd be happy to meet the person that if there's a designer or a creator, here I am. I have ears. I can hear. I'm not dumb. I'm not stupid. So I don't think if it was a clear-cut answer like that, I would be happy to say, I would happy to meet the creator. Someone could take me by the hand and say, this is Allah, this is Dan, Allah, Allah, Dan. and we can have a good conversation, and he can show me the way that he made it. And I think that's one thing we need to keep in mind, is like when he used the example earlier in the presentation regarding a calculator. Well, we can go to Sony, Ericsson, to these different factories. We could actually see calculators being made, so we have a good reason to believe that there is a designer of the calculator. But when we look at the laws of nature, it's not like we can go to the factory where God's creating planets and Earth, where he's creating planets and he's creating different laws of nature, and he's creating the processes that create diamonds. We can't go to that factory. So I have no way to know that there's a designer. All I can say is that we know that there's heat, we know there's pressure, and we know that the diamonds come about. So I think that question begs the question. It assumes the answer within the premise.
I want to respond to that one. So with regard to the snowflake and diamond example that you brought up in your lecture in the first time, actually, it's interesting what you said is, you said, well, I mean, these could be natural processes. And the thing is that I kind of mentioned that in my presentation about the could be or might be or possibly and this and that. And what you picked was you chose the snowflake and you chose the diamond. You chose things which are immaterial, which have no life, which are quite actually very simple, whereas I chose the cell. I chose something which is extremely complex, which is made of protein molecules, which is made of amino acids. I talked about the coincidental formation. So these things, it's not about begging the question. These things scream out for an answer. How do you explain this? And actually what ends up happening is that someone who doesn't want to explain this, they're actually dodging the answer, which is actually staring them right in the face.
Do you want to respond to that?
Just briefly. I mean, there might be great questions, and we might not know where the cell, how it came about or how it originated, but it goes back to us saying we don't know. And I think it is another form of God of the gaps to say just because we don't know something, we're going to say, well, then God must have done it, and it must be the creator. But I think we could just follow the evidence, and there are questions we don't know. Why is there something rather than nothing? I mean, it's a great question. I think you even raised that up in your speech as well. But I don't believe that something came from nothing. I believe that, as far as I can tell, as far as you go back, there always was something. The first law of thermodynamics says matter cannot be created or destroyed. Right? We can burn down this table. We can, push the ashes around. We can hit them with a hammer, but there's still going to be ashes. We can't destroy matter. And as far as all of our observations, it wasn't created either. It was always there. I know that's really weird and baffling, and I think we should kind of revel in that mystery. And maybe we will find out someday. I just don't think we have enough evidence to conclude that at this point in time.
Kind of along those same lines, Dan, but a little bit different. If you believe that Allah did not write the Quran, then who do you think did?
I guess I can start with, when we look in, I frequent libraries, and I'm faced with thousands and sometimes millions of books, and I feel overwhelmed by the amount of knowledge, the amount of information at my disposal. But I read one book, I know that every book that I've read so far in my life has been written by a human being. And so if I read 10,000 books, which I haven't, I'm probably right around 1,000 maybe. But if you read 100 books or 200 books or 300 books or 400 books, and you read, 4,001 books, the next book, the deduction that you make based on all your previous experiences that it was written by a human being. So I don't know exactly who, because I didn't live during that time. I mean, the scholars trying to figure out who wrote an ancient text is almost impossible. We don't even know that Homer wrote the Odyssey, right? But we know that somebody wrote it. There are different theories out there. Ones that I was looking up on the internet where the authors had access to Syrian Christians or liturgy, and there's similarities between Syrian liturgy and there was some evangelicals that came into that part of the world at that time. So I'm not familiar enough to know to say exactly, and I don't think very many people would, even the best of scholars. But I think that we can say that it was probably a human based on all prior experience, especially given the content of the Quran that I raised today, which looks very similar to other works from antiquity.
Okay, again, I'll address this to Dan, but then have Imam Mustafa give the Muslim perspective. Dan, what do you think happens when you die? Where do you go if there is no God?
It's interesting that where do I go when I die? I would say when I die, I'm dead. I know that sounds strange, but once my mind, my brain decomposes, I can't think anymore. Once my eyes dissolve into the earth, I can't see anymore. Once my ears disappear, I can't hear anymore. So I am no longer. Once my mind is gone, I am gone. I hope that I'm wrong. Again, as I started off in my speech, I hope that there is a God. I hope that there's a resurrection, that He brings me back to life. But there's problems even with the idea of a resurrection, which I had in my prepared to talk about, but I didn't actually address them. So maybe I can go over just like one or two of those right now if I can find it. For instance, if a child dies, how is the child resurrected? Is it resurrected a baby, or is it resurrected a mature adult? Is there aging in paradise? Do you get older? Does a 30-year-old go to 31, then 32, then 33, until 700 and 800 and 1,000? I mean, how exactly does it work? I think there are some problems with philosophical problems with resurrection. If an older person dies, let's say in his 90s, and he lost his mind towards the end of his life, does he resurrected a 30-year-old? And what happens in those years between 30 and age 70? Does he just forget about those years, or he just remembers those years? And he's 30 years old for the rest of his life? I think there's some serious problems. There's also the problem of identity, meaning, for instance, if I have this, this paper that I wrote, and I have all my notes on it, if I was to light a fire right now and reduce it to ashes, and God recreates it, is that the paper that I wrote, or did God write that paper? Is he the source and origin of it? If a kid is building some building blocks, and the mom's helping the kid do the building blocks, and the kid makes this nice little tower, and then it accidentally falls down, and the mom feels bad and doesn't want the child to cry, so rebuilds the blocks. Is that the same blocks that the kid built, or is that the one that the mom built? So that goes into questioning, what would we be the same thing if God was to bring us back to life? I know it's a little bit abstract, and I didn't get to my notes to be able to word it properly, but I think I've answered the question as far as what I think happens and what I hope happens. I hope that living in a good place, but it doesn't look likely. It doesn't look too probable.
Imam, if you'd like to get the Islamic perspective of that.
Well, the Islamic perspective, most people know what it is that Allah will recreate, He can create, and therefore the argument is very clear from the Quran, is that some people deny Allah, and they say, well, they deny the afterlife actually. And they say, do you think that our bones are going to be reconstructed after they've turned into dust? After you die and you're in the grave, and you really think that there's going to be another life? I mean, how could that be? That doesn't seem to make sense. And the Quran gives the answer. So, don't you think the one who made you in the first place can reconstruct your bones? It's much easier to actually reconstruct something that's been destroyed, that's already been created the first time, than create it in the first place. So this is the argument that Allah gives, is that if you're going to deny the afterlife based upon what you see in terms of cause and effect, in terms of what you see materially, well, if you believe in Allah and you believe that He created you the first time, it's much easier for you to recreate something. So it happens generally. If you create an Eiffel Tower, like he mentioned, and some pieces fall down, right, it gets crumbled, it's easier to recreate it because you already have the map, you already have the plan, and of course Allah is in power over everything. So He can put back your very fingertips. In terms of the argument that I won't even address the other argument.
Can I just clarify?
Yeah, I didn't understand it, to be honest with you.
That's why I need to clarify.
It makes sense to me.
So basically, I'm asking the question, if there is a resurrection, would you be the same person, or would you be a replica? There's a difference between the same person and a replica, and that's what I wanted to illustrate with the two examples that I used. If God recreated the paper, would that be the same paper or a replica of the paper? And even if resurrection is logically possible, it's a long way from saying that it's probable. Some have likened it to astronauts building a space center in the center of the sun. Though we can imagine it, it does not make it very likely.
Okay. Professor, may I just, is man the quote-unquote God of an atheist?
is man the God of the atheists? And so I guess it depends on what we mean by the term God, right? So it's all about definitions. Typically, the term God means creator. And is man the creator? I mean, we can create things. So it depends, what type of creating are we talking about? Are we talking about creating something from nothing? We can't do that, but that's what theists believe. So it just really depends on how you define God in this sense. But I don't see myself as God in the typical sense. Of course not. Do I think that humans should be? I do believe that humanity is extremely important. That again, that humans should have food and clothing and shelter and healthcare, and all the pure air, clean water. And if this makes me thinking that humans are gods, then I guess so be it.
Just 2 quick points off topic. One, I'm not taking questions on my cell phone this time. I know we did it one time. Please don't text me your question. You have to write it and give it to Saf. I'm doing logistics through texting. It's something completely different. Second, if you see me getting a little tired, I sleep at 10 usually. So just don't think I'm getting bored or something like that. All right, this people have texted me that you look like you're falling asleep. No, I'm listening and I'm awake. Okay, very awake. But in terms of what Dan mentioned, and in terms of the question, there's 2 concepts in Islam when we're talking about God, or when we talk about, you say God is a deity in a sense. What does it mean? There's 2 terms. One is called I don't want to use too many terms here. One is called the oneness or tawheed of divinity, tawheed al-uluhiyya. One of them is tawheed al-rububiyyah. One of them talks about creation, meaning God is the Lord, the Supreme, the one who creates all of these things. So in that sense, I doubt that any atheist is actually making that claim. I doubt that they actually make that claim, and that's where most people do not make that claim. The second claim is tawheed al-uluhiyya, meaning the divinity, meaning being divine, meaning that God is worthy of worship, right? So I think that's probably what the question was aiming at, is that are you kind of worshiping yourself if you're not worshiping Allah, if you're not worshiping a God? And I would say that, yeah, in a sense you could say that. Because in the sense that when you say you're worshiping yourself, meaning everything revolves around you. You see, in Islam, everything revolves around Allah. You are a servant. He is your master in that sense. He is overpower you. You're either worshiping Him or you're worshiping something else. If you're not worshiping anything, technically by giving precedence and priority to yourself over everything else is technically worshiping yourself. So I just wanted to clarify. I think that's what the question was intending. So that's the Islamic answer.
All right, now can I respond to that? All right, now that I understand that sense of what it means, I asked a lot of my seminary friends when I was going to Fuller Theological Seminary, what would you do if God asked you to strap some explosives to yourself and blow up a Starbucks? And a lot of my friends would hesitate. They wouldn't answer the question right away because they would think back to the story where God asked Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, and I think in Islam it's Ishmael, right? Yeah. So there's a sense in which if God asked me, it actually frightened me to a certain extent to think that here are good friends of mine that would be willing, or at least were considering, doing something that's really destructive to other human beings. And I think that's a fundamental problem when we're willing to do anything just because our master or because God asks us to. And I would actually advocate a position which says, if God asked me to kill my mom or my sister or my friends, I mean, it would be absolutely absurd. I wouldn't even consider it. I would say, hell no. I mean, sorry don't want to say any extreme words, but no. I will not do anything that seems destructive to other humans, ever. And I think if more of us took that position, we'd have a much better world. So maybe we need to consider ourselves on a higher level than we do.
Islam means peace, by the way.
Professor Dan, do you believe that morality is relative? For example, if the Aztecs believed that human sacrifice was moral, does that mean it was okay? If not, then who is the ultimate authority on what morality is?
That's a great question. I don't even think that morality is something that's exclusive to humans. There was a study done with raised monkeys where they put monkeys in a cage where they can see each other, and what they did is they got the monkeys to realize that if they ate their food, the other monkey was shocked. So if the monkey ate, his friend over there would be shocked. And what these monkeys did is once they realized that their friend would be shocked, is that they stopped eating food. One of them, I think, for like 7 days went on a hunger strike, and another for like 12 days went without food because he didn't want to see the other monkey go through and experience pain and suffering. And so I would say that morality is based on pain and suffering, pleasure and well-being. In other words, we tend to try to avoid, because of our biology, we have that central nervous system. Again, I think in some sense we could say that morality is universal because we all share the central nervous system. We don't generally like pain. We try to avoid it. We want to live happy lives. We want to be well-fed. We want to enjoy relationships with each other. And so I would say that morality is about what is it that brings about happiness. And I don't think that sacrificing anyone in here I don't think it should bring about happiness. If it did, it would only be for a small group of people, because for the most part, when we put other people at risk, like sacrificing them, that puts ourselves at risk on some level. And I don't think that it's smart to put ourselves at risk in any way whatsoever. So the best morality is the morality that brings about the most happiness for the most amount of people. And if you have a morality that's, committing genocide, that puts yourself at risk. If you're murdering others, you're going to be at risk for being murdered. If you're going around stealing, people might be more apt to steal from you. So it doesn't make sense. So I would say that in some sense, yeah, morality is grounded in our biology, and our genes want to survive. So we're always looking to survive. And I would say more than surviving, we would try to thrive. We should try to do things that bring about pleasure and happiness. And I would say the principal thing that we could do, at least in this country, would be to take money out of elections would be one, right? When the corporations are funding elections and they call the shots, at the end of the day, our leaders are forced to make decisions based on basically those who own them, who have paid for their elections. Moreover, I think that we should automate jobs. Who wants a crappy job working at a computer for 8 hours a day? We have machines and technology that can do everything that we do faster, better, quicker, without complaining, without going on strike, without eating, without taking vacations. So why not automate all these human jobs, and then we could be free from the slavery of work. We can automate, like for instance, our agricultural industry right now is 90% automated. It's already going there. We have technological unemployment. As machines, get faster and better, and right now the owners of the machines are putting us out of work with it. But if we own those machines, we could collectively free ourselves from the slavery of work, and then we could focus on things that actually bring meaning and significance to life, like relationships, like traveling, like art, like music, like dance, like drama, things that bring meaning and significance and purpose. So I would say that we can have a robust morality based on our own biology, our own desire for peace, happiness, and well-being.
So yeah, I think I agree with Dan on the elections and all of those things, but I am a computer scientist, and I used to work 8-hour computer job. It wasn't really that bad, but it's okay. I enjoyed it. But I just want to clarify some points. First of all,
you shouldn't have to do it though. That's the point.
Shouldn't have to do. Okay.
Yeah, if you want to,
automated.
Feel free.
Okay. The sacrificing people, this whole concept, like the killing people and all that. Keep in mind that the story of Abraham, it was a test whether to see he loves Allah more or he loves, his son more, and he was not sacrificed in the end of the day. So this whole, taking it far to like these native tribes where they're like sacrificing human beings and all that, that's at least not something that's there in Islam. Now the moral point that you mentioned with regards to moral relativism, I think is a major, major concern that I have. Because the concern here is that if you simply believe that yes, well, morals are relative and it depends on circumstances, or you say that, well, I'm a utilitarian. Utilitarian meaning that I want the greatest good for the most amount of people possible. The thing is, there's some major, major issues with that. Now, one, you can't measure it, the greatest amount of good. And the greatest amount of good or pleasure or happiness or pain, absence of pain from one person to another is very different. A criminal enjoys, going and succeeding. A dictator enjoys, oppressing his people. Some people go and they enjoy dropping bombs because it means success for them. And this is precisely the problem that we have. I'm going to make a few political comments here. This moral relativism is what is causing the vast majority of problems in the world. Why did World War I result? Why did World War II result? Because the European countries, each of them thought that, well, it's good for me, it's in my best interest, therefore I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to take over this continent, or I'm going to take over Europe, I'm going to take over the world, or whatever it may be. The same thing's happening in terms of what just took place in Egypt. It doesn't matter whether you're trying to free yourself. If you don't have absolute morals, it's about what's good for my country. So if my country's oil price is going to go up, and in order to keep it down, we have to keep someone in power, whether he's harming somebody else, well, my pleasure and my benefit and my people's benefit, we have to go ahead and take that thing. And if you say, well, you have to measure it somehow, there's utilitarianism here, and you have to determine this person, that can't be done because it's virtually impossible to do that, and who's going to do it? So when we have this moral relativism issue, what happens is, what's good for me, or what's good for my people, or what's good for my nation, or you say, all of this is the result of so many bad things that actually all the negative propaganda that, well, the person of religion strapping on a bomb and all of that, actually is minuscule compared to the person who thinks that, well, my pleasure and my happiness, or our happiness in terms of the way we measure it, is first. And that's more dangerous to be an atheist than to be any type of religious fanatic whatsoever.
Okay, go. I don't think that it was moral relativism that primarily caused these wars, but economic realities. These are land grabs. These are countries trying to get more resources for themselves, and I agree with you. But I agree with you on one sense, but I disagree with you on another sense, in the sense that I disagree that if a country just says, we're going to get everything that we can for our people and have no concern for other people in the world, that's exactly what you get in this country. We've been exploiting other countries for years and years and years, and you don't think that there's any consequences to that? There's not something that the CIA calls blowback? You don't think that people are going to get angry and maybe, for instance, what happened to 9/11? People say, oh, it's because of our freedom. It has nothing to do with our freedom in this country. It has to do with us having troops in Saudi Arabia, in the holiest place for your holiest place, right? It has to do with our support of Israel to the tune of millions of dollars every year, that are the oppression of the Palestinians. So it has economic reasons are the primary causes for wars. And so what I'm advocating isn't that we just look out for ourselves. I'm saying if we look out for every human on the planet, because it's these borders too that are dividing us. Why are there borders? If we drop the borders, we realize that we're one people, we wouldn't have land grabs. Everything would be all of ours. And if we focused on cooperation, if we focused on sharing and not competition and competing, we'd have a different world.
Imam Mustafa, we've got quite a few very similar comments, and I want people to obviously stick to the topic, of course, but I guess several people felt that some of the verses that Professor Dan may have presented were perhaps taken out of context. So there are many people who are asking that you would at least explain or answer the arguments that have been proposed about some of those verses, such as the beating up of wives, etc., etc. Are you willing to do that?
Yeah. So first of all, he mentioned just a ton of things. Each of them requires some explanation because you have to have a correct context of what's taking place. You have to have a correct understanding of the Arabic language. So I'll try my best to answer as many as I can. First of all, women have ritual impurity when they're touched. Ritual impurity, for those of you who don't know, Dan obviously knows, ritual impurity is like being in a state of where you need to cleanse yourself. You need to take a bath, for example. Now, here's the thing. When touched, see the term touched over here, right? It's different in the Old Testament. Touched in Islam, touch is a nice way of saying gender relationships, right? So it's not about like, you come and touch and, oh, you're gone, that's it, now you have a problem and all of a sudden. The thing is, I actually mentioned this in my class yesterday, is that Islam really focuses on modesty, what we call haya in Islam. And this modesty is manifested in using certain words. So rather using direct words, using a word like touch actually means a relationship in terms of that. So that's what it has to do, and it's not simply just for women, it's for men as well. So if men and women have a relationship, both of them need to take a bath. It's not one of them. Anyone who studied the basics of Islamic law knows that. The next thing is the 6-day creation. So the 6-day creation. So if you look at those verses again, first of all, the word day, okay, in the Quran, the word yom. The word yom is day. Now, day, it says in the Quran that a day or a yom in the sight of Allah is like 50,000 years. Another place it says a yom, or this time period in the sight of Allah, is this many thousands of years. So what you find is that the word yom doesn't simply mean a day like the day that we know it. It means a time period. And if we're talking about the stages of creation, we're talking about a particular time period. So why is that important? It can't possibly mean a day, because how is a day measured? A day is measured by the rotation of the earth relative to the sun, etc., etc. How could you possibly measure a day before the actual creation of the earth and the sun? So the day is referring to a stage of creation. The whole thing about 8-day creation or the 8-stage creation, 8 yom creation, if you like, it's very simple. If you look at the verses, 2 of them are referring to processes that took place in the same way. So Allah is saying, well, in these 2 days, this and this took place, and on this same process also took place on 2 days. Meaning that there's an overlap. Meaning that I'm explaining to you that this is what happened in 2 days, and this is also what happened in 2 days, and therefore we're explaining to you 2 different things taking place at the same time. So for example, if I say, it took me, 2 days to search for a job. It took me 2 days to eat the giant hamburger at whatever that pound burger place is, Famous Burger, that place everyone goes. It took me 2 days to drink a gallon of water, and it took me 2 days to run 2 miles. Does it mean that I'm talking about 8 days, or am I talking about different events, which when you describe somewhere else, you're referring to 6 days or 6 stages? You're referring to the same thing, so there's no contradiction at all. If it had said that Allah created the world in 6 days, and then you have another verse that says Allah created the world in 8 days, and then you have another place somewhere that says Allah created the world in 12 days. Given contradiction, there's major problem, but we don't have that issue. I just have this random thing about Muslims winning and losing wars, which we'll leave that part. Contradiction. Everything is from the decree of Allah. So the whole thing is getting into the concept of what we call in Islam qada and qadr. Right? Everything is from the decree of Allah. And why test people if He already knows what's going to take place? Well, see, this is a big problem in philosophy that people have. They can't get their minds around it. And the reason why they can't get their minds around it is because we as human beings are bound by time and space. Allah is not bound by time and space, meaning He does not exist in time and space. So the fact that He knows something, or the fact that He's going to be creating something, doesn't simply mean that He's bound by the exact same thing. So in that sense, well, why does He have to test stuff if He already knows it hasn't happened yet, in our perspective? From His perspective, it doesn't exist in time. So the time itself doesn't exist, because we believe that He's Al-Awwal, the first, and Al-Akhir, the last. He's the first and the last, before He's not bound by time in the first place. So if a human being tries to understand, well, why did Allah have to do it this way or this thing, you're never going to be able to understand it. Try to imagine right now in your mind. Try to imagine infinity. Go all the way thinking the biggest thing you've ever seen in your life. Try and imagine infinity. It's impossible. Your mind can never ever grasp it, because you're bound by time and space. You can never picture it. No matter how big you try and picture it, you cannot picture it. Because you are bound by time and space. That's what human beings are, but Allah is not bound by time and space. Moral instruction. Okay, so about the cutting of hands and all of these things. See, again, we have to know Islamic law. So, for example, Dan mentioned the part about, most of the, theft, or most of people stealing and theft and all of these things, it has to do with poverty, it has to do with hunger, it has to do with all these things. Absolutely, this is all a bunch of propaganda that's come out. I remember, growing up myself, I'm like, this is so bad. I remember watching Aladdin. Anyone seen Aladdin before? Come on, that's it. I have the whole soundtrack memorized still. It just won't go out of my head. Come from a land, from a faraway place, etc. Anyways, that's one of the most biased movies I've ever seen. Now that I realize it, in fact, it was so biased that they had to change the opening song that actually started out there. The Disney actually had so many complaints, they actually had to change the song. And one of the biases which they did not correct is this image of the princess, taking the apple from the merchant and giving it to the poor kid. The poor kid who's sitting there doesn't have any food, doesn't have anything to eat. She takes the apple, she says, "You want this apple?" She takes the apple and she gives him the apple. And what do you have? You have this giant, huge, Persia, actually, well, it's in Persia, but this Arab-looking guy with the turban on, messed up teeth and all that, comes out and says, "Do you know what the punishment for stealing is?" And then he pulls out his sword and he puts her hand down on the floor and he's about to chop it off. Right? This is the imagery, and this is what we grew up with. Oh my goodness, how could a religion do something like this? This poor woman was stealing, etc., etc. But if you go and you look at Islamic law, we're talking about chopping a hand. There's so many conditions. I'm going to mention 2 major conditions in Islamic law that have to be fulfilled before you go and chop anyone's hand off. Number 1 is that person should not be stealing out of necessity. So if a person is stealing out of necessity, it does not apply at all. No one's hand gets cut. In fact, the person, if you want to punish someone, you're going to punish the guy who actually put him in that state, whether it's a government or whether it's official, whatever it is. Number 2, that thing has to have a minimal value. So if you go and you steal a little apple, for example, that's not a sufficient amount of value. So when you study Islamic law, it has to have a specific value. I believe it's half a dinar or a quarter dinar or dirham or something like that. I forgot myself because we don't apply it. So I don't know. I didn't care to memorize it really, but there's a rule there. Number 3 is that thing has to be in a locked and stored place. If you steal something public, right, something that's publicly out there, right there, like the apple was sitting there, someone comes, it was not protected, it was not in a safe, it's not in a cash drawer, you go and you steal that thing, your hand doesn't get cut. So this whole concept of hand cutting and stuff like that, most Muslims don't even know the conditions. They don't know the conditions because if someone is stealing one thing for necessity, someone is stealing something because it's just hanging there and you're just kind of tempted and just kind of, put it in your pocket or something like that. Something completely different, stealing from a supermarket, and someone going up to a cash register with a gun, going and taking that thing out. So these punishments are there. There's a bunch of conditions. We should know the conditions. And number 2, look at the punishment. I have a major problem with the society that we live in, especially when I was in Europe. I have a major problem with the fact that people are killing people, go and get murder, people go and steal things, people go and do all these things, and what do? Put them in jail for a few days. If he's got some connections, whatever, he's going to be back out on the street. The prisons in Europe in Belgium, really, we drove by, I saw a hotel there, and I'm like, this is the nicest hotel I've ever seen, made of glass, just beautiful, right? And you find out, actually, no, that was a prison, actually, that's not a hotel, that's a prison. Every prisoner has a PlayStation inside. I know the kids are like, oh, dude, that's awesome. But every prisoner has a PlayStation inside. Right? And there's so many things, like, it's not about punishment, it's about making the society a better place. So all these excessive punishments, especially people being punished and tortured, the vast majority of people who get punished and tortured, when they're innocent people, I have a major problem with that. When Professor Tariq Ramadan, he called for a moratorium on the death penalty, I completely supported what he's doing. Why? Because his issue was not about whether Islam does it or doesn't do it. His issue was whether it's being implemented or it's not being implemented. Okay? Slavery. So slavery, in terms of Islam, if you look at slavery, the way Islam abolished things, right? When it came to alcohol, for example, there was a gradual process in eliminating alcohol, right? So alcohol is prohibited in Islam. We don't drink. We don't even drink a small amount because of the effects. The effects that it has on your mind, the effects that it has on your family, the effects that it has on society. You could figure out all the wisdoms. You know, vast majority of people have an understanding and they realize that, yeah, we have a major problem with alcohol. In fact, Europe realized, I mean, America tried with the backing of the US Army to implement the prohibition. And they utterly, utterly failed. And when it came to Islam, people were able to build up their faith and belief in Islam. When I say faith and belief, I mean an understanding, correct understanding of the belief and all of that. They were able to build it up such to an extent that they were able to eliminate alcohol. Anyways, the point is that it was a gradual process. Why was it a gradual process? Aisha, who's the wife, radiallahu anha, may Allah be pleased with her, who's the wife of the Prophet, peace be upon him, she said if the first commandment that had come down to the people was, give up your alcohol, he said people would not be able to do it. In fact, they would start drinking more because that's the way people are naturally. So they needed to build up their belief, they needed to become stronger believers, they needed to pray, they needed to do this and this and this, so that we can get to the stage where we eliminate these things. Slavery is exactly the same way in Islam. Slavery was something that existed, and by the way, slavery that existed in America was something that completely different that existed in Arabia. Slavery in America was primarily, almost for the most part, was race-based. If you're of a certain skin color, that's the one. We have a major problem with you, that's the issue. Slavery in most other parts of the world had to do with, there was a lot of immorality, a lot of injustice, but it was not primarily race-based. Okay? So that's one issue. The second thing is the fact that Islam came, and what you find is it talks about freeing the slave. Go and do a Google search, or not a Google search, but do a Quran search about how many places it tells in the Quran, free the slaves. And it says if anyone frees a slave, this happens. In fact, the Quran has put a penalty that if you make this mistake, if you violate the sanctity of the month of Ramadan, you have some options. You're either going to feed this many poor people, or you free a slave, or you do this. So the freeing of slaves is there, and it's a gradual process, and it's basically getting to a society where you're going to be eliminating slavery, but it's going to be done the same way as slavery was eliminated, in the sense that the alcohol was eliminated. It had to be a gradual process. And this is particularly what you find in Islam.
Well, in the interest of time, I know there's a lot more.
So this is a completely, this is a whole debate. This is a whole other topic. And inshallah, we need to have this topic as people are going and writing a bunch of articles, and this is a big, political issue that comes up. So, this group is going to come into power, and they're going to, all of a sudden, they're going to throw these bunch of veils on the average American. People are scared, man. This is what happens. This is a major political issue. Oh, Egypt has now fallen. People coming to me, oh, does that mean that we're going to have to start wearing veils in America because Egypt is going to come somehow take over America and start throwing, veils on top of the women and all of that? Come on. I mean, just try and understand where it's coming from. Try and understand, the democracy. Let people live the life they want to. This is their moral system. I'll stop there.
Can I try to keep my...
Sure, I mean, obviously, yeah, you can...
Okay. It seems odd to think that God is actually, compromising on something as serious as slavery. That he's saying it's okay for a time, but eventually we'll eliminate it. Can you imagine him compromising on rape? Saying it's okay to rape women for a certain period of time, but we'll slowly and eventually eliminate it altogether. Why would God compromise? Why wouldn't he say rape is always wrong in all times, in any circumstance? Slavery, it doesn't matter if it's just racial-based or if these are slaves taken in war. Slavery is always wrong at any time. And maybe the people won't obey God right away, but if God compromising on slavery, something doesn't seem right. As far as the prison system in Europe, which I think is much better than the prison system here, the prison systems don't address root causes. They don't, if you lock someone in a cage for 5 years or 10 years, they don't come out better people. So I think that the Europeans are right. We should be about creating a better society. We need to be looking at root causes. What caused the person to steal? Whatever the reason, whatever the circumstance, it wasn't that he had hands. And if you cut him off, that doesn't change the conditions, the circumstances in which created the desire to steal to begin with. I think something more humane would be therapy, would be counseling, would be education, job training. I mean, any number of things that would actually create better conditions and create a new environment for a person. Putting them in a cage doesn't help. Putting them in a place where there's respect and where they're treated as human beings, not like animals, that changes people. And some people can't be reformed, it can't be changed. I mean, there's some people that are biologically different than us. They're sociopaths. They don't have the capacity to experience other people's pain. They don't feel other people. They don't have that sensitivity. They don't have empathy. They can't have it biologically. And so should we just start, putting them in a cage or killing them or what? I mean, none of those things seem right to me. I think we should give them as pleasant of an existence as possible. It wasn't their fault. They didn't choose not to be able to experience other people's pain. As far as the contradiction in regards to the creation account, I think if we read the text, it says, say nothing will happen to us except for what, it is he who created the heavens and the earth in 6 days, and he firmly established himself on the throne of authority. And then in the next text it says, God created the earth in 2 days, set the earth and mountains and sustenance in 4 days, and finally completed the 7 heavens in 2. And so it's kind of ingenious to say that days doesn't mean days, it actually means 50,000 year periods. And if that's true, fine. If you have 6 periods of 50,000 years, that's a lot different than 8 50,000 year periods. I don't think we've really reconciled that particular passage. But even if it doesn't, I don't think that's the most important thing. I think the most important issues that I raised this evening in regards to the Quran is God's going to burn people's skin off, put new skins on just to burn it off again. And I raise the question, if that's not cruel and unusual, what is? I can't imagine anything worse than burning someone's skin off, putting new skin back on, and burning it off again and again and again. So I'll leave my comments there. Maybe we can have this discussion more later.
Yeah, so this is the third one, so I'm not adding an extra or anything. Few things about what Dan said. First of all, the whole 8 periods or 6 periods or 50,000 years, I don't think he got my point. My point is that sometimes Yom is mentioned in the sight of Allah. It's 50,000 years, sometimes it's mentioned 100,000 years. The point is that it's relative, meaning that the Yom term is a time period. So it's not about 8 periods of 50,000 years, 6 periods of 50,000 years. It simply means that it's a relative time period, so that answers that problem. In terms of slavery, again, the whole issue of slavery, you have to understand the world, the system, the way it worked. Slavery basically meant prisoners of war. Today we have prisoners of war. What do we do with them? Some people go and put them in Guantanamo, whether or not they actually did anything or not, torture them, etc., etc. You have to do something with prisoners of war. The reason why they're not releasing the Guantanamo prisoners is because everyone's scared what's going to happen, what are they going to do if we let them in our country, if we let them loose, blah, blah, blah. The whole point is you need to come with a solution. What do you do when this happens? Because it happens. This is reality. This is not an ideological fantasy. It happens. So the problem, the issue here that the Muslim is always putting forward is, you can sit there and criticize, well, Islam has this harsh law, Islam has this harsh law. The question is, what alternative do you propose? Clear-cut alternative, okay, what should be the punishment for this particular crime? I agree with you 100%. The prison system is horrible. It doesn't cause any, many solutions. People go into prison, the vast majority of people who come out of prison, they go and end up committing the same crime. There's no rehabilitation, there's no education. Absolutely. Islam doesn't have this huge punishment, prison system, and all that stuff. This is definitely a problem for our society. And but question again to you is, what is the solution? Islam brings a possible solution here. You can sit there again with the same argument and say, well, I don't have an answer, but I think it should be different. It's the same thing that I mentioned before about the court on trial or about a murder case, where how do you describe this dead body right here? You come up with a thesis, I will come up with a thesis. If you just say, well, I don't like your thesis, you can't just simply stop. You need to come up with something practical. You need to show the results. You need to show whether it works or whether it doesn't work. And about the people who can't be changed, just a quick note on that. The people who can't be changed, I agree, yes, there are some people who can't be changed. But what's the solution? Again, you need a practical solution. You can't say, well, this guy's a kleptomaniac, this guy has a problem with stealing. I mean, I had my MP3 player stolen in France by a guy who has a problem with stealing. So what's the solution? So, well, we can't punish him because it's just natural. So what, you're going to leave him out there so he can steal everything from somebody? You need a practical solution. So, that's it.
All right, Dan, apparently there are quite a few scientists and engineers in our crowd who all attacked me during the break. No, I'm just kidding, not attacking me, but I wanted you to address, I'm going to lump some of these things together so you have a little bit extra You say senses are needed to prove there is a God, see him, touch him, picture him. So the question was, do you believe there's electricity? If you do, prove it. Prove that there's magnetism if you believe it exists. Related to this, the whole scientific part of it, please explain what you mean by 99.9% of species not existing anymore. We cannot disprove a negative, can we? Also, how do you or any vegans know for sure that plants do not feel pain? Recent research is to the contrary. And if you need to repeat those as we go, that's fine.
Bill, you had quite a few questions there. The first one had to do with how do I know electricity exists if I can't see it? I've actually been shocked before. So I've actually experienced the, firsthand through my fingers, through my senses, the effects of electricity. Also, something as simple as turning on the light and I see, the light bulb. I'm putting in light bulbs all the time, and so there's something that's powering it that I can actually see. So I mean, there's a certain degree in which I'm using my senses as receptors to the data that's coming in through my experience. Also, as far as magnets, I've played with magnets and I can feel the magnetic force. So again, I'm touching it, I'm seeing it. I could even bite the magnets.
I'm not proving anything.
Not proving?
No. What is electricity?
Let's again. We'll keep it to the speakers at the podium.
On a very practical level, I think what I'm saying is I could access these things with my senses to some degree. I can see the light. We can turn off the lights. I see the lights go off. I can feel the pressure that the magnets bring. I can, like I said, electrocute myself. I think these are all clear examples of evidence through my senses that these things exist. Now, I don't have that kind of experience when it comes to God. I don't see, touch, hear, feel, nothing. In fact, I was a believer for 12 years, and I prayed till my soul was raw that God would give me some clear, reason to believe that He was there, and I heard nothing. At some point, I finally had to concede that my prayers were hitting the ceiling. As far as the second question, which was...
where are you getting your information about 99.9% of species not existing anymore?
I don't have the source here. It's pretty universally accepted. It's either 90 or 99.9% of all species that have ever existed are out of existence. I don't think it's even a disputed point. Through the fossil record, everything from trilobites to dinosaurs for existence. We know those aren't in existence anymore, and I think modern science would say that there's something to the extent of 100 species that goes out of existence every day. I mean, we're talking about insects, we're talking about birds, we're talking about all kinds of different species, fish species that we're not aware of, that are actually going out of existence. I mean, we're aware of some of the major ones, like condors, that were on the brink of going out of existence. We know some of the bald eagle was on the brink. We have a whole endangered species list of some of the ones that we prefer. But I mean, there's smaller organisms and smaller species that we give less preference to. So I think, I don't think it's a disputed point. I mean, you can do a Google search, look up, species that have been in existence, and the number should pop up. But I mean, if it's a different number, I'm open to it. I'm not like going to die on this hill. Was there another question?
The other one was, how do you or vegans know for sure that plants do not feel pain? Recent research is to the contrary.
Right, and plants might feel pain. I mean, they don't have a central nervous system, so at some point, I have to survive. If I lived in a different period of time where I had to kill another sentient being to survive, I would. So if it was incumbent upon my survival, I would do it. So I mean, at the end of the day, if the plants do experience pain, we have to do it just to survive. And I think that, I think every species has its own interests. The lion is trying to survive, the gazelle that it's, is trying to survive. Every species is trying to survive. So if I had to eat something and kill another sentient being to survive, I would. So at this point, I think it's very clear, it's a lot more clear that the pigs and the cows and the chickens, in fact, chickens are the most abused animals on the planet. The egg-laying hens, when they're born, they're separated. The males are put on a conveyor belt because they're completely useless because males can't lay eggs, and there's two different types of chickens that they've bred, the broiler chickens and the egg-laying chickens. So the males go on a conveyor belt, they're shredded up immediately into a grinder, and if that doesn't happen, they're thrown into trash cans alive, and they get suffocated to death. And then the chickens, their beaks are cut off at birth, the females, and their beaks are cut off without anesthetic because they're put in cages that are so small that if they did have their beaks, they would peck each other to death. They're so miserable. They're in cages where they can't open their wings. They're indoors, so they don't get to see the sun. They don't get to feel the breeze. And the ammonia is so high from their excrement and their feces that they get all kinds of different cancers. 90% of chickens have what's called leucoma. It's a type of chicken cancer. Their feet are on metal cages where they get these blisters on their feet. They're stacked in cages on top of each other oftentimes in the factory farm, so they're excrementing on each other. I mean, there's so much abuse, but they have no ability to exercise their muscles. So when they are picked up, a lot of their legs break, their wings break when they're taken out of their cages. So I mean, the cruelties go on and on and on, and it's completely unnecessary. It's so horrifying if you watch videos of this. And so I've decided not to support the industry, that where we get our eggs, we don't even think about the cruelty and suffering behind the eggs. So I would say that's obvious suffering. We know for without a doubt. So I said we should try to avoid that in any way that we can and try to oppose that as sentient creatures ourselves that know what it's like to suffer.
So yeah, just reversing the answers here. On the treatment of animals, first of all, I agree with Dan completely. This is why in Islam we have something that's called halal. Halal is a way to treat the animals, make sure that they're slaughtered correctly, make sure that they experience the minimum amount of pain, make sure that when you're slaughtering them, somebody else, the other chicken behind the line is not seeing the blade, so that it's not getting scared, it's being kept in humane resources and all that. So a little marketing here, there's going to be a new term called halal tayyib. Halal tayyib means basically everything that Dan mentioned, is that it's not just the slaughtering process, but it's the way that the animals are treated, the way that they're growing up, and he's absolutely right about the eggs and all of these things. It's horrible what's happening, and it's against Islam to be doing this and not doing something about it. So, please join us in that effort. That's a great thing. With regards to the first, there's a lot of questions in that. With regards to the first thing about, Dan gets shocked. He experiences, the effects through his senses. I mean, that's exactly the point that I was making, is that yes, you don't see the actual effect. I think the point that we're trying to make is you don't see the actual effect. You don't see the shock necessarily. You may not see the magnetism, but you can experience it through your senses, absolutely. And what the point that I was trying to make in my presentation is you experience this life through your senses. You experience the cells, you experience the organization, you experience all of these things through your senses, but you want to see Allah. You say, no, but I want to see it. Yet, when it comes to these other things, you experience it through your senses, but you don't see the actual essence of it. And that's exactly the point that I was trying to make.
Professor Magis had several comments talking about or asking why you seem to always be focusing on pain and suffering. So I'm kind of, again, trying to lump some of these together. So if Allah does not exist, how does night turn to day? Who controls the universe? What helps hold planes up in the sky? Without pain and suffering, how would we ever appreciate happiness? Again, why are you focusing on pain and suffering yet ignoring the amazing miracles of the world?
Did that question assume that Allah is holding the planes in the sky? I didn't quite understand. Does the question imply that Allah is actually making it dark at night? I mean, we know why. The Earth is rotating, and as you're on the side of the planet that's not facing the sun, it gets dark. And when it starts rotating to the side where it's facing the sun, it gets light. So I don't think we need an explanation of a deity to explain, why planes are flying. I mean, there was a trial and error period where, a lot of early individuals that were trying to put a plane up in the air were crashing. Many people died trying to get planes in the air. So is Allah not helping those planes, but he helps the later planes? So I'm not sure that gets us very far. The other question was?
I mean, it's related to those type of issues of, gravity, and then again talking about pain and suffering. Just you
Well,
seem
why
to
do
be
I focus
focusing.
on
Yeah.
pain and suffering? I think I raised the pain and suffering I raised the issue because I think it's something, as believers, we want to look at all the positive things in the world. And there are positive things in the world. We can talk about positive things in the world, but I think oftentimes the eyes of faith kind of see the good but don't see the bad. And I raised passages in the Quran that I find problematic because usually we see all the good passages, and there are good passages. But sometimes we overlook and we skip over and we jump over some of the more negative ones. So I highlight the bad ones, especially in the question, does Allah exist? And so we ask what kind of being is Allah, and Allah is the most compassionate. He's the most merciful. That's a pretty strong claim. And so I'm saying, let's look into the world and let's see if what we find matches up with a being that cares more than any one of us, more than my grandmother. I mean, my grandmother would never, ever, cut someone's hand off. She would never, ever, ever, burn someone's skin off and then put new skins on, do it again. But I mean, so the claim in the text is that Allah is more merciful than my grandmother. But my grandmother wouldn't do those things. So I point out, problems in the Quran or those kinds of things, and also just the pain and suffering in the world, and saying if God is big enough and if he's powerful enough and he's good enough to stop some of the extreme, I'm talking about tsunamis that are killing 300,000 people at one time. What lesson is being learned? At whose expense? When a woman's husband dies and all of her kids die, what is she learning? And is it worth it? She killed her kids to teach her a lesson. I mean, the kids had to die for the mom to learn something. It just doesn't make sense. And so I raise those questions, because I think there's oftentimes overlooked.
What's positive about that? You're looking at the negative side.
Again,
I don't know anything
keep the
positive
response. Let's keep the responses.
Yeah, as far as the woman, that loses her husband and all her kids, what's positive about that? Nothing. I think it's tragic. And I think us just being there to comfort her, there's no words that you can say when something like that happens. I think it's almost cruel to go and say, God's trying to teach you something. There's a lesson to be learned here. I think it's insult upon injury. It's bad enough that she had to go through it. To actually tell her that there's something that God's trying to teach her, I think is almost cruel.
I think I answered this in my presentation, but I'll just bring it up again. Again, there's an assumption of a false premise. And the premise is that if Allah is good and he's merciful, then he must stop every single instance of evil that ever takes place. Any type of bad thing that takes place. That is going to be a perfect world and a perfect life, and that's what we call in Islam, we call it Jannah, we call it paradise. No problems, no issues, everything's great, no problems. The thing is that doesn't happen. Now, why doesn't it happen? Because life is a test. And if he did stop every single thing, someone goes and tries to pinch somebody else, and Allah interferes and stops that. Oh, I'm merciful, I'm Ar-Rahman, I'm going to make sure he doesn't pinch you. What's the point of, there's no test involved, he gives you all the answers. So I mentioned that point before, but at one point I didn't get to in the end of my presentation when I was talking about this point is, Dan reminds me of angels. It's the biggest compliment I can give, right? Dan reminds me of an angel. And the angel that I'm referring to, or the angels that I'm referring to, is in Surah Al-Baqarah in chapter 2, verse 30. Is that if you look at the story of Adam in the Quran, it's very interesting. It says that when Adam, the first human being, was being created, the angels asked a question. They said, why would you create this thing, right, that can do bad, that can shed blood, that can cause problems? Right there in the beginning of the Quran. Why would you create this thing that can do so many bad things when you could create somebody like us where we don't disobey you? We don't cause any problems. We don't cause any bloodshed. We only obey you. And what did Allah say? He said, I know exactly what I'm doing. And then he went and he gave him an example so that they can understand. And the example that he gave him was the fact that he taught Adam knowledge. He taught him the ability to do things in this life, and he showed that Adam is a creature that has free will. So this human being, because of his free will, is able to rise to the highest moral heights. If you have a bird and you keep it in your cage, you say, well, my bird loves me. My bird is really, really loves me. Best bird I've ever had. You open the cage, you see how much, that bird really loves you. That's the way you're going to tell. That's why human being, according to Muslim scholars, has the potential to become better than an angel because they have the freedom of choice, they have the potential, they have the ability. That's why there's a book that Jeffrey Lang, revert Muslim, who was also an atheist and talks about his atheism in his different books. He wrote a book called Even Angels Ask. His whole book is about, I was asking the exact same question just like Dan is asking. And when he opened the Quran, he read it, he got to that verse right in the beginning, and he was saying, that's my question. That's the question that I've been asking my whole life. Why? Why so much problem? Why so much evil? Why? Because he was focusing on the same thing, mentality of an atheist. And that entire book details the same conclusion that he came to, same conclusion that Immanuel Kant came to about the categories of existence, etc., is that there are several good reasons. And some of them I mentioned to you right now, and I'll leave it at that.
So the next Muslim scholar will be Dan. Dan will be the next Muslim scholar.
Again, let's keep the comments up here at the table.
I just want to say that, why is God testing people in the first place if he already knows everything? Not only does he know everything, but he's the one that decreed it beforehand. It doesn't seem like an authentic, genuine test if he already knows what's going to happen. So what's the test for? And if it's for knowledge, I would give back all my knowledge if I can, stop the pain and suffering in the world. There's too much. It's excessive. It's happening in every single country. Especially with the concept that one day it will be perfect. Why not now? Why the tsunamis? I understand that humans were created with the ability to kill others, but what about the tsunamis, the earthquakes, the tornadoes, the volcanoes? These things we didn't make. We didn't do anything. Something doesn't seem right.
Well, to look at the clock, it's 11:20. So unfortunately, I know no matter what time I would have ended, you guys would have been, oh, come on. But again, in the interest of time, being it is a weeknight and our speakers do have other obligations as well early in the day tomorrow, I'd like to thank both Professor Dan Mages for coming out and of course our own Imam Mustafa Umar. Perhaps you can all come up on your own and maybe they're willing to give you their contact information or whatever, and you can ask them the questions that maybe we weren't able to get to tonight. Perhaps we'll schedule something again, in the future as well. There's always seems to be a great interest. Again, it's something that we like to do on an ongoing basis, so hopefully we can schedule that as well. But again, thank you very much for your cooperation, for being respectful.